traveled to the farm and estate once belonging to the president in Kinderhook, New York, and talked with 2 historians at the Van Buren National Historic Site. Also, we visited with a Van Buren descendant. The program's about 2.5 hours and begins with a brief video biography.
It is said that Martin Van Buren is a great magician. I believe it. But his only wand is good common sense, which he uses for the benefit of the country. Andrew Jackson.
They called him the Little Magician, in part because of the power he wielded as the smoothest operator in New York State politics. Genial, suave, and shrewd, Martin Van Buren was the quintessential behind-the-scenes diplomat, renowned throughout his career as a peerless master of the art of the deal. Born just after the American Revolution in 1782, he was the first president to enter the world a U.S. citizen. He was from the Dutch community of Kinderhook, New York, and his nickname later in life, Old Kinderhook, helped popularize today's common slang term, okay. He acquired his taste for politics at an early age. His father owned a tavern, where as a young man, Van Buren enjoyed listening to the stories of visiting politicians on their way to and from the state capitol in Albany. Reputed customers included Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. He didn't attend college, spending instead several years as a legal apprentice before being admitted to the bar in 1803 at the age of 21. After a swift rise in New York State politics, he arrived in Washington as a trusted Secretary of State under Andrew Jackson and inventor of Jackson's new Democratic Party. He went on to serve as Jackson's vice president and then handpicked successor. But people just couldn't summon the same sort of enthusiasm for Van Buren as they did for his predecessor. At his inauguration, people sat politely through Van Buren's address, but when they spotted Jackson, they went wild, giving the former president a standing ovation. Jackson and Van Buren were indeed different. Tennessee Representative and Van Buren foe, Davy Crockett, put it this way.
Van Buren is as opposite to General Jackson as dung is to a diamond. He is what the English call a dandy. He struts and swaggers like a crow in the gutter.
True, Van Buren did enjoy fine food and wine. He also liked expensive clothing, favoring coats with velvet collars and snug gloves made of soft leather. His enemies accused him of wearing corsets and perfume. Diplomatic and agreeable almost to a fault, Van Buren was also somewhat of a waffler, often straddling different viewpoints in part to help placate a nation deeply divided over slavery. According to a popular account, a senator once tried to trap him into a declarative statement by asking him if the sun rose in the east. Replied the president,
"Well, Senator, I understand that's the common acceptance, but as I never get up till after dawn, I can't really say."
Van Buren and his vice president, Richard Johnson, took office in March of 1837. He moved into the White House accompanied by his 4 bachelor sons, aged 20 to 30. Because his wife, Hannah Hoos Van Buren, had died about 20 years earlier, Washington was without a White House hostess until Van Buren's eldest son, Abraham, married Dolly Madison's niece, Angelica Singleton, who assumed official duties. Van Buren had been in office only 2 months before a depression known as the Panic of 1837 struck the nation's banks and the people's pocketbooks. It wasn't long before the public and the press turned on their leader. The attacks puzzled the president.
Why the deuce is it that they have such an itching for abusing me? I try to be harmless and positively good-natured, and a most decided friend of peace.
Van Buren's bad press helped fuel William Henry Harrison's victory in the election of 1840. After an unsuccessful bid for the Democratic nomination 4 years later, Van Buren returned to his New York estate, Lindenwold. 4 years after that, however, he was back in the fray when the anti-slavery Free Soil Party asked him to run for office. He failed to win a single electoral vote, and the defeat marked the end of his political career. After the election, Van Buren continued to farm Lindenwold, where he lived for another 14 years. He died the morning of July 24, 1862, 16 months into the American Civil War. He was 79.
This is Lindenwold, the 36-room home built by our 8th president, Martin Van Buren. It's near the village of Kinderhook, New York, Van Buren's birthplace, about a half-hour south of Albany. At its height, Van Buren's farm had 220 acres. Today, the home and 38 acres are a National Historic Site open to the public seasonally. Today, it's open to you as we learn about the life and times of Martin Van Buren, our 8th president. Here's our lineup for today's program. Our host on site for the next 2.5 hours is Michael Henderson of the National Park Service. He's superintendent of the Martin Van Buren National Historic Site. And 12 years here, lots of experience about Martin Van Buren. He'll be here to answer your questions about our 8th president. We'll also be joined by Patricia West, who is curator of the Van Buren National Historic Site. And later on in our program, you'll meet Mary Lee Whitner, who is a descendant of Martin Van Buren. Our phone lines will be open throughout. Our idea here is to get you involved in presidential history, and here's how you can call in. Eastern and Central Time Zone viewers, 202-624-1111. Those of you in the western half of the United States, the Mountain and Pacific Time Zones, 202-624-1115. Well, Michael Henderson, as we begin this morning, one of Martin Van Buren's contributions is to our language, and a word that is used the world over. It's the word okay.
That's quite true.
What's the connection?
Well, okay, a word that's probably used at least 5 or 6 times a day by English speakers worldwide, is one of the strongest Americanisms that I think you can probably point to, and is often associated with Martin Van Buren. Okay for Old Kinderhook, or all correct. And the etymology is sort of interesting because during the period of the 1830s, editors and newspaper editors often would take a kind of country bumpkin role in writing, and they would spell things incorrectly, which was also sometimes a push at Andrew Jackson, who was a notorious bad speller, as am I. But all correct became associated with Martin Van Buren during the election of 1840 because the Tammany Association, or the Bucktails, decided, in their support of their candidate, Martin Van Buren, took the phrase and kind of made a spin on the spin of all correct being our guy, Old Kinderhook, is okay. And as people had lots of, like Old Hickory or Old Fuss and Feathers for Winfield Scott, Old Kinderhook became associated with Martin Van Buren. The spin got another twist, actually, as Van Buren lost the election of 1840. The Whigs certainly would make lots of jokes that Van Buren was okay and backed off to Kinderhook. So the phrase, although it probably wasn't associated immediately with Martin Van Buren, became so connected to Van Buren through the popular lore that, and it's a term that survived in the English language and can be traced to Martin Van Buren.
Which room in his home are we in right now?
Right now we're in the parlor, the formal parlor. He sometimes referred to it as the drawing room. And it's pretty typical of an 1840s room, very light white and gold wallpaper. You noticed that, I'm sure, when you were at the Hermitage. There was a white and gold drawing room. Although this is probably a little more refined and a little more in style. Van Buren's always very interested in style and was always on the cutting edge, both in furnishings and his personal appearance.
As we look at the portrait of Van Buren right beside you and me, I'm going to ask you to describe Martin Van Buren. How tall? What did he sound like? Give us a description.
Martin Van Buren was about 5'6", so he's certainly one of the shortest of our presidents. And he was a delicate-featured young man with red hair. He balded quite early in his life. He got to be relatively rotund, about 170 pounds and 5'6", so he wasn't, he was sort of plump and pleasant, but he was supposed to have the most intriguing, sparkling blue eyes, which were supposed to be quite captivating.
And what would his voice have been like, being from this region of the country at the time?
Well, he was actually a native Dutch speaker, although he certainly spoke English quite fluently, and the Dutch language survived in the Hudson Valley hundreds of years after the British conquest. So he may have had a slight kind of Hudson Valley accent to his English speaking, but he was also not a great orator. He had sort of a high voice and wasn't known as a great orator, so he didn't have the, the wonderful rolling voice that would gain him popularity in public speaking. He sort of had a high voice.
Is he the kind of person that, with all your studies of him, you would say, I would like him?
Actually,
what's his personality like?
I like him more and more in many respects because he's comfortable to be with. He does not make the kind of absolute enemies that Old Hickory did, you know, not shaking a cane and saying, by the eternal. Van Buren could separate political differences from personal differences, and throughout his life maintains friendships with people that you would not suspect that he would. And I like that about him, and I think that in that respect he's quite a personable and approachable person. He's also certainly a man of the 19th century, and in that respect, you know, he's utterly foreign to me, you know, to understand someone from the middle part of the 19th century and to say that I could be friends with him it's a very different world. But certainly in the human area, I think that he's very approachable, and I like him.
First call, Houston, Texas. Welcome to the program. You're on the air.
Yeah, okay. Listen, I was trying to reconcile Van Buren with Clinton. What does he have to do? I thought this morning they were supposed to talk about what's going on in Congress for on the Kosovo affair. What does Van Buren has to do with Clinton?
What does Van Buren have to do with Clinton? Well, actually not a whole lot. But you might talk about Kosovo in respect to other international events that were happening during the Van Buren administration. Certainly Van Buren's method and during his administration was basically to keep the United States out of war. One of the reasons he was very cautious about bringing Texas into the Union was that he was quite concerned that it would cause war with Mexico. And of course, subsequently, we did have war with Mexico over Texas. With the Caroline affair and with Upper Canada, with the Aroostook War and with the designation of the Maine border with Canada, Van Buren was always very cautious about keeping the United States out of conflict unless it was absolutely necessary for the preservation of the Union.
This is week 8 of C-SPAN's 41-week series called the American President's Life Stories Tour. Our goal throughout this year is to introduce you to the men who served in the U.S. presidency, to understand better American history through their context, and to learn about their leadership capabilities and what the country was going through at the time of their presidency. We hope each week you'll join us as we visit a site associated with one of the presidents and talk to people who have studied them to learn a little bit more about our country's history. Burlington, North Carolina, you're next. Good morning.
Good morning. I've been really enjoying this series. I remember reading in Gore Vidal's novel about Aaron Burr that he implies that Martin Van Buren might be Aaron Burr's illegitimate son, and I wonder if you have any thoughts about that. And I'll take my answer off the air.
Okay, I actually have a lot of thoughts about that. Well, one of the things I always do when this question comes up is I hold up the book, which I can't do for you right now, but you will see on the cover, it says, Burr, a novel. A novel. And it is an historical novel, and it's really quite a wonderful read, and I encourage you to read it. What the author does in this historical novel, though, is to try to link Martin Van Buren's ancestry to Aaron Burr, and wonders why Van Buren is a Burrite long after it's popular to be supporting Aaron Burr. And one of the things he does is he says that perhaps Aaron Burr, traveling through Kinderhook on one of his travels between New York and Albany, perhaps, bedded down with Martin Van Buren's mother. It's an interesting story. The problem with it is that Kinderhook is a tiny, small, closed-knit community. As Martin Van Buren said when his daughter married, when his son married an English woman, the last 5 generations of my family have been exclusively Dutch. Martin Van Buren's mother was widowed at this before she married Mr. Van Buren, and it seems somewhat unlikely that the dashing Aaron Burr would be interested in a widower woman who was running a tavern in Kinderhook. Also, one would suspect that in that very small and close-knit community, there would be a lot more rumors than you would have those rumors used against Van Buren. Van Buren is always being attacked, and people are taking every opportunity to attack him. I'm sure questionable antecedents would have been one of the ones that would have come up early on.
We sent a camera to his birthplace. We'll show that to our audience. How far is it from this home, Lindenwald?
It's only 2 miles from this home, this area and this countryside is very important to Van Buren. Martin Van Buren was born in the village of Kinderhook, and you can see the birth sign there. Kinderhook's remained remarkably the same. It's still a small hamlet. It's still a relatively closed-knit community. Certainly no longer Dutch speakers, but Martin Van Buren was very connected to this place and very connected to these people. And it's interesting that he makes his home here at Lindenwald, only 2 miles away from where he was born, for the last 21 years of his life. It was a very important place to him, the community and the place.
Next call comes from 20 miles away, the state capital of New York, Albany. You're on the air.
Hello. Hello, Michael.
Hi.
This is your cousin David.
Hi, David. How are you?
Doing very well. You look great on TV.
Well, thank you very much.
Make your family proud. My question is, what was the president's attitude towards the military during that time? Did he serve in his service? And whether he did or not, what was his overall perception of the military? Was he for it or against it? Thanks a lot.
Sure. Van Buren was actually offered a commission to be an officer during the War of 1812, which he declined. He was not an avid military man. Certainly not the hero that Andrew Jackson was. Van Buren did believe that we needed a military in order to preserve the Union. Basically, one of the hard points for Van Buren's reelection in 1840 was that he basically was supporting a standing army of 200,000. That standing army was basically fighting Seminole Indians in Florida. And that was also another very questionable policy of the government. And it cost him some support. But I think Van Buren would have been supportive of the military. He did believe in the principles of Jeffersonian democracy, and he would have believed that as citizens we have the need and the right to arm ourselves to fight to preserve the Union.
We got a call from Mr. Henderson's relative in Albany. Let me tell you a little bit more about him. He's a native of the city of Albany and has spent his life in history. His bachelor's degree is in history from Penn State University, and went on to receive a master's degree in American social history from the University at Albany. What inspired you to a life in history?
Well, actually, it was not my favorite subject when I was in high school. I thought it was a little boring and dull, but I always liked reading historical novels like Burr. As I came to be interested in stuff, and one of the reasons I was very interested in material culture and things is because they sort of represented to me aspects of previous lives that I could touch. I could actually sit in the chair that Martin Van Buren sat in. Of course, I wouldn't do that since this is a museum, but that's what got me interested in history. And as I came to learn more about people of the past, I became very interested in how similar we humans are, and that we're facing the same challenges and concerns generation after generation.
Havre de Grace, Maryland, on Martin Van Buren. Welcome.
Thank you. I just have a question about, I was reading a book about the campaigns of 1836 and 1840 and how different they were, that 1840 was the first time really they hit the campaign trails and partisan politics sort of took over. And I was just sort of a brief reference in a book called Packaging the Presidency, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how different the campaign was in 1836 and 1840 and what kind of campaigner Martin Van Buren was. And I'll hang up and listen to your answer, and I enjoy the show very much.
They are actually quite different campaigns. In 1836, of course, Van Buren is the seated vice president. He has the blessing of Andrew Jackson, who is still a very popular and very charismatic leader. Much like George Bush was the seated vice president when Ronald Reagan was anointing him as a very charismatic and very strong leader.
Let me interject for just a second so people know that between Martin and Van Buren and George Bush, no other vice president was successful in succeeding the man they served as president.
That's quite correct. Van Buren was the last elected vice president who was elected to the presidency until George Bush. And then he did not win re-election, and George Bush did not win re-election. In the election of 1836, Van Buren is sort of the anointed and the chosen son. The economy is still reasonably booming. There's still lots of turmoil, but Van Buren wins with a reasonable majority in 1836. Of course, several weeks into his administration, the United States suffers its first major economic recession, or depression, depending, I suppose, on where it fell on you. But by 1840, the Whig opposition basically decided that they wanted to oust Van Buren at any price, and they needed, the Whigs needed to be back in power. And what happens is, as the electorate is expanding through the Jacksonian period, and more free white males are enfranchised to vote, the nature of politics changes, and the nature of campaigning changes. So by 1840, you have the first kind of real modern campaign with mudslinging, with campaign songs, slogans, keep the ball rolling. I mean, there were all kinds of modern pieces of a political campaign that come by 1840. And for Martin Van Buren, he basically did not campaign in 1840. He basically stayed in the White House and did business. he felt that it was somehow unbecoming to campaign, much as some of the founding fathers thought that it was in bad taste to go out and pound the pavement for a job, that, you know, anybody who wanted it that much probably shouldn't get it. Van Buren didn't really campaign in 1840, and in many respects he lost the election of 1840 rather than William Henry Harrison winning it. He certainly had problems, but he certainly didn't campaign actively. So they're different elections.
After this next call, we are going to spend a little time on this house, which we're visiting today. But our call is from Aromas, California. Good morning. Caller, you're on the air.
Good morning.
Thank you. I don't hear anything because I turned everything down.
That's the way it works. We can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, that's fine. And good morning to Michael Henderson.
Good morning.
I appreciate all the scholarly people who are giving this series, and I hope that all our children can get their copies for their school rooms. I'm a retired school teacher, and I had to do a genealogy for one of my grandchildren who is in 8th grade last week. And the family story is that we are related to Millard Fillmore, but nobody ever did anything about it. I have a Bible, and I'm not related, unfortunately, to Van Buren, but I think it's marvelous that you're giving his history today. And I'm just calling to commend that and to say that some of us out here are getting really excited about finding out how to get our past presidents documented some way. All I have is a family Bible.
Thank you very much.
Well, certainly Millard Fillmore is another famous American president from New York State. There are lots of genealogical books that have been written over the years, and certainly now with the internet, there may be access to many more of them. I'm not that familiar with Fillmore's genealogy, but I would always recommend the reference librarian at the local library. They're always an incredible source of help, and they're always willing to help you with genealogies.
There are 4 New York presidents, by the way.
That's true. 3 of them are related, distantly. Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, and Martin Van Buren are all related through a common ancestor, and Millard Fillmore, of course, who's buried in East Aurora, New York.
And as that caller mentions that she's a retired teacher, one of our major focuses in this program is that we hope classrooms and students will use the materials. We've got all kinds of teaching materials available on our website, and it's www.americanpresidents.org, and it will lead you through how to get more information about teaching.
And I'd also like to add that the National Park Service has a series called Teaching with Historic Places, which are curriculum that are developed. They're on the web. If you go to the National Park Service homepage, you can look for Teaching with Historic Places. There is one on Lindenwold. It's on Martin Van Buren and his return to the land. So certainly the educational importance of this stuff is being picked up all the way around.
All right, let's spend a minute on the house. We sent a camera. This house is called Italianate in its architectural style. We sent a camera up to the tower.
Wonderful.
So we could look around and see what the countryside is like. We're showing that to the audience right now. Talk about what it was like when Martin Van Buren was here.
Well, actually, it's very similar to when Van Buren was here. You probably see a little more trees than were there at the time. The area is far more deforested than it is now. But basically, the rural character of the area is much the same as it was then. And this view from the tower, you're looking out on kind of onto the front lawn. Now you're looking west, actually, towards the Catskills and the Kinderhook Creek and the Hudson River. This is basically Van Buren's farm. And the farm part of this house is a very important part. This was always a working farm. Van Buren made money running this farm. So it's important to not separate the Italianate mansion from the rest of the farm.
This is what it looks like standing on the first floor looking up the stairways to the tower.
Yeah, the tower is an amazing thing. This is a 4.5-story tower. You're looking straight up it. This, in effect, has the great aesthetic possibilities of making the house more modern, but it also served a very practical purpose of creating a servant's staircase.
Is there a point at which, if you went through and the time period, you would have seen old Mr. Van Buren himself standing up there gazing out over his farm?
It's quite possible, but more frequently than that, you would see Mr. Van Buren answering his own door. People were very surprised that the ex-president answered his own door when people would come to call, and he would invite them in and have refreshments. He was very approachable in that respect.
Jasper, Alabama, on Martin Van Buren. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I just want to congratulate you on your excellent series. And I just had a couple little questions. I was wondering why they referred to him as the little magician, and also why his refusal to spend land revenues led to his defeat in 1840.
Well, one of the reasons he was called the Little Magician is because he had a knack for pulling off things that people thought were impossible. He also had an ability to become personal with people and to get them to negotiate. He's also known sometimes as a negotiator, and the Little Magician sort of implies that. He's also known as the Red Fox of Kinderhook, and as you know, a fox is sort of wily and crafty. A lot of these were sort of negative appellations. You can look at them either way. Certainly the ability to negotiate is critical in a democracy, and I think Van Buren always felt that way. The second part of your question was why he...
Land revenues.
Yeah. Van Buren was a strict constructionist in his interpretation of the Constitution. He very strongly felt, the way the Jeffersonians did, that if it wasn't in the Constitution, these were powers that were either given to the federal government, denied to the federal government, or reserved for the states. And spending federal monies on improvements that didn't benefit the entire nation was something that shouldn't be done. So you will see that occasionally federal monies are spent on the improvement of harbors, because basically a harbor is a point of entry for the entire country. But you'll notice in the Jackson administration, with his writings to veto the Maysville Road Bill, doesn't want to spend federal monies that will help improve only a specific area of the country. This was not seen by the Whigs as being the right policy. They had an expansionist policy and wanted the government to do everything.
Our colleague Garney Gary has one of the tough jobs this morning. He's got a camera on his shoulder and is moving from room to room as we talk today, hoping to capture parts of the house that help illustrate the conversation. For perspective, we are on the first floor, right inside the main door. And as you open the main door to Kinderhook, the dining room.
The dining room.
It seems like an odd place for a dining room.
It does seem like an odd place. It's actually, it's a very political room. When Martin Van Buren bought this house, he bought it while he was running for re-election in 1839, although he didn't move in until 1841, I'm sure earlier than he had wanted to. The first thing he did was take this regular Georgian central entrance home and rip out the central staircase and create this expanded large dining room. And a lot of it had to do with the way Van Buren conducted politics. His charming little dinner parties were an example of how he did political maneuvering. He was not the great orator. He was not going out and raising people up on, into a froth. He was inviting strategic political leaders over, having dinner, having discussions about politics. This room is a very political room in this house. It's very important to understand what he was doing here. And of course, you are walking right into the dining room, but you're walking into a wonderful entertainment space that's, done with lavish French wallpaper and Brussels carpets. It was a big deal.
While you're on the visitors, who, famous in American history, would have been a guest?
Henry Clay was a guest here. Thomas Hart Benton was a guest here. Many of the political leaders of the day came to this house. And interestingly enough, a lot of the, Van Buren owns this house after he's left the presidency, basically. So it's interesting that Van Buren, even though he's no longer president, is still a driving force in American politics. And you see Van Buren as a major character in cartoons well into the 1850s, long after he's left the presidency. He's an elder statesman who people come to consult with.
54 years old when he went into the White House in 1837. As we talk about Martin Van Buren, our next call comes from San Diego. You are on the air.
Yes, tough question here.
That's my favorite kind.
Knowing that, considering that Van Buren really did nothing to end slavery and would not do anything to end slavery, I was wondering, how does it make you feel really deep down inside that you're actually the superintendent of the home when this man, a lot of blacks are free to his chagrin? And I'll wait for your answer. Thank you.
Well, personally, as a black American, I have issues with that. But the point of studying history is to investigate those reasons. And Van Buren runs a very difficult course throughout his entire career. He was born into a family that owned slaves. He inherited 2 slaves from his father. He is putting together a political party of which the primary concern is the maintenance of the Union, to keep the Union together, that this very new experiment in American democracy has to be preserved. The founding fathers weren't able to deal with the issues of slavery. Basically, you know, they even wrote it into the Constitution. So by the time you get to Van Buren's generation, it's this kind of second generation of Americans, it's a very testy issue. The country is becoming polarized on this issue, and Van Buren's position shifts throughout his career. He is, of course, a supporter of the gag rule. You know, he is, of course, the chief magistrate of a country that is perpetuating one of the greatest evils known to mankind, the chattel slavery. But he is also trying to push the envelope against the tide of slavery. He's certainly always against the extension of slavery into free territories. And I think you see in the Hammett letter, I think you see in his losing the nomination in 1844, the Democratic nomination, and again in 1848 when he's running on the Free Soil Liberty Party, Van Buren's position on slavery is becoming, he's actually moving to the left, which is unusual in older politicians to become more liberal. But personally, it's a difficult issue, but you know, it's a scar in the history of this country that we have to talk about and we have to deal with. Not being a superintendent of Martin Van Buren National Historic Site wouldn't allow me to engage in the conversation that we're having right now about what that legacy of slavery is.
Meredith, New Hampshire, next. Welcome, caller.
Yes,
Meredith, New Hampshire, you there?
Yes, my call was just about the same as the call right before me on slavery, and where I had read about Martin Van Buren was in the book Black Mutiny, based on the movie Amistad.
Excellent book.
And I was wondering, you basically answered most of my questions on the slavery and how that affected his political career to some degree and what the politics were. But I'd like to know more if I had missed John Quincy Adams' report on how he interacted with Van Buren on this regarding the Amistad situation.
Sure.
Thanks. Well, let's spend a minute on the Amistad incident and the resulting trial and how it fared politically at the time.
Difficult issue for the Van Buren administration. I think you know basically the outline of the Amistad event. Africans who are cargo on a Spanish ship basically mutiny, the ship is captured, it falls onto Long Island, then the slaves are brought to Connecticut. The Van Buren administration realizes that this is going to be a lose-lose situation all the way around, and their initial effort is to keep it out of the courts. This is a very complicated issue. And Amistad the movie, which is a fabulous drama, kind of doesn't give enough depth to the history and the complexity of the legal issues to really get into it. So the Van Buren administration's initial response is to say, this is an issue of international affairs. This is cargo, because Africans who are slaves are cargo, as difficult as that is to talk about, perhaps belonging to the Spanish crown. Spain at this time is a superpower and not a country to be, to be ignored. Of course, once the issues of how the Africans are going to be handled comes into the courts, it becomes a different issue. And the Van Buren administration basically says it's a judicial issue. The executive branch is not going to go into it. But it's a very difficult situation for him politically, because this is opening up wounds which are just under the surface. Remember, we had just been through the nullification crisis with South Carolina. We already have Southern Democrats who are on the edge of deserting. And, in hindsight, it's very easy to look back and say, oh, well, the Civil War is a long way away.
Only 20 years.
At the time, nobody quite knows what's going to happen. John Quincy Adams, who's also a fascinating character, the old man, of course, absolutely detests Martin Van Buren. I mean, he doesn't like a lot of people, but he absolutely detests Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren supporting the gag rule, which means that you can't mention the word slavery. It's the S word. You can't talk about slavery in the Congress, which is absolutely the most undemocratic and un-American thing you can imagine. The reason people are supporting the gag rule is they don't know what's going to happen. So the Amistad event, which goes over the course of several years and several trials, is a very interesting blip in what's going to become this polarization in American politics. And certainly John Quincy Adams takes full advantage of this. In his famous speech, which you see in the movie. He harkens back to the Founding Fathers. That speech, I'll urge you all to look at it. It's actually on the internet. If you read that speech, he's not really talking about the Founding Fathers at all. That's really just kind of movie drama. In the speech, he's talking about the evils of the Van Buren administration and Martin Van Buren. And it's interesting that he's taking this opportunity to politicize this issue.
Great questions already this morning, and just really a bit into our 2.5 hours on Martin Van Buren. If you'd like to participate in this discussion of late 1830s America, we welcome it. 202-624-1111 for the eastern half of the U.S., 202-624-1115 for the western half of the country. Next, as we look at the sitting room at Lindenwold, which is Van Buren's home, we will listen to a caller from Van Buren, Missouri. Good morning, caller.
Good morning. First of all, I would like to thank C-SPAN for this wonderful series. My name is Sandy Buren. I actually work for the National Park Service. I'm a history major, and I spent the majority of my career in the Northeast, and am familiar with the New York area. When I moved to Van Buren, Missouri, I've been curious since I was here, and have tried to explore through the information in our courthouse how Van Buren was named. I have not been able to find that. I have purchased the Teaching with Historic Places series, and that's a wonderful series, and thank you for recommending that. We've used that in our schools. I've been very curious to know how Van Buren, Missouri connected itself with the vice president at the time. When it was, I was able to find out that Van Buren was vice president when the town of Van Buren took his name, but no connection to why they would choose that name. And my question is, would you know of anything that was going on during that period in 1834 when this town was named? The other question that I have is, I have been looking for a book, and if you could recommend something that we could carry in our bookstore here at the park that would make that connection, because I often get that question, do we have anything in the bookstore that relates this town to the vice president at the time? And I would appreciate very much listening to your comment. Thank you.
Well, I can't say specifically. There are, Michigan came into the Union while Van Buren was president. Certainly after the Missouri Compromise, which certainly Clay had a major hand in, but Van Buren was also party to. It's not uncommon to find place names that are respectful of a character, a present character, although it's a little more unusual. The country was growing quite rapidly at the time. They may have just run out of names.
Did you ever do a search to see how many towns named Van Buren there are in the country?
Actually, I have not, but I know there are bunches of them, and it's a name that has sort of an aristocratic air to it. I know Abigail Van Buren chose that name because she thought it was, it sounded respectable and proper, and so it's quite possible there might be multiple motives, but it's certainly worth looking into. That's a great idea. When did Lindenwold come under the care of the National Park Service? Lindenwold didn't come into the National Park Service until 1974. It was a bill that was signed by President Ford. Although Lindenwold had been looked at as a historic house museum from the early part of the 20th century. Basically, the steam didn't get rolling until maybe the 1930s. Basically, after the Democratic Party has looked back to Thomas Jefferson, and we sort of get this fusion of house museums as being a place to talk about politics. But the house was basically under private ownership from the time of Van Buren's death through the time the Park Service came. It was a long time. And when can people visit here? And we hope they will. You can visit here 7 days a week, from the middle of May through December 5th, which is Martin Van Buren's birthday. And we always have a ceremony on his birthday. We know that he always celebrated his birthday. So. Next call is from Bellingham, Washington. Good morning, caller.
Good morning. Yes, and appreciate your series so much. Can you tell me the role of militias during Van Buren's time in office? I'm particularly concerned about the militias as a rationale for the Second Amendment and for the use of that rationale in 1999 in comparison to the time of the writing of the 10 amendments to the Constitution and Van Buren's time.
I think militias were certainly seen as being an organized, state-sponsored group. I mean, I think the way we use militia presently is somewhat misleading in that when we're referring to militias in the 19th century and perhaps even the end of the 18th century, we're really looking at the people's right to defend themselves, and the people meaning all of the people, the body politic of the state. That's really quite different than a group of people who decide that they are, a militia representing themselves, kind of outside of the bounds of the state and outside of the authority of the state.
I'm going to bring another person into our discussion this morning, and another part of the staff here at the Martin Van Buren National Historic Site. Her name is Patricia West, and she is curator here. Good morning, Patricia. Where are you right now?
Good morning, Susan. I'm standing in Lindenwold's very chilly basement, almost directly behind where you and Michael are seated. And we're going to show you a few of the basement spaces this morning. We use these areas, the service areas of the house, to discuss what the National Park Service refers to as untold stories. And that's the stories of the people we usually don't hear much about in traditional historic site interpretation. And in the case of Lindenwold, that's primarily the Irish domestic servants who made the household run, and the farmhands who made Van Buren's extensive farm run.
What was the crop on the farm?
Van Buren had various crops. He had a large orchard. He had traditional ground crops, like I think potatoes was his most successful crop, and that's sort of ironic considering that his servants came here as a result of the potato famine in Ireland in the 1840s.
How common would it be for someone of his means to have Irish as domestic servants?
Quite common, especially in the Northeast. As a matter of fact, you could argue that the great explosion of elaborate domesticity that we associate with the Victorian period, including the beautiful kinds of dining accoutrement that you see upstairs, Van Buren's own fabulous clothing that we'll talk about a little bit later, are all directly based on the fact that that there was a great availability of inexpensive domestic labor.
Are you able to establish a head count among the farmhands, the slaves that we heard about before, and other domestic servants, what the total staff would have been for Lindenwold at its height?
The short answer to that is no, although we're working on it, and we work on it all the time. And the reason for that is has to do with the way the working people and poor people are not as present in the documentary record as those of us who do social history would like. I can go to a census record and I can count that the day the census taker came here in 1850, there may have been 4 young women from Ireland and 1 young farmhand present in the house, but we won't see, for example, documentation in the census record of the free blacks who may have walked over here from a nearby free black community to do labor on the farm, or young women who may have been hired in to do seasonal domestic tasks. So what we have to do is not just look at those traditional documentary sources and count, but we have to look at the kinds of activities that occurred here that are documented in Van Buren's record, and then extrapolate what kinds of labor, how many people would it really take to conduct a dinner party in that huge central hall that you saw earlier with that many chairs seated around the table. Of course, it's obvious that there are a lot of people involved in a 200-acre farm and an elaborate Victorian lifestyle, such as Van Buren had here at Lindenwold.
Patricia West has a PhD in history from SUNY Binghamton, and she's written a book about this topic of the role of domestics in historical life. It's called Domesticating History, the Political Origins of America's House Museums, published this year by the Smithsonian Institution Press. Ms. West, we're going to take a call from Chagrin Falls, Ohio, and then have you continue on the tour of the basement. Chagrin Falls, you are on the air.
Good morning. I think Mr. Henderson's fabulous. You should have him on more often. Quick question for him on the how Van Buren got to be vice president. Would you mind holding forth a little bit on how John C. Calhoun was removed from the ticket and Martin Van Buren was put on it in 1832?
Sure. As you know, Andrew Jackson's first vice president was John C. Calhoun. Calhoun was certainly a man of many grudges and many strong feelings. Throughout the beginning of the Jackson administration, there were many disagreements between the cabinet members over Margaret Eaton, and there were many opportunities to be downwardly mobile for Mr. Calhoun, and basically he was in a position where he thought he could try to oust Martin Van Buren, who was the Secretary of State, from any further political career. And after the resignation of the entire cabinet, Jackson, with Van Buren, appoints Van Buren to the Minister of Great Britain, basically ambassador to Great Britain, to the Court of St. James. Van Buren goes off to England and is highly embarrassed at the fact that the Senate does not confirm his nomination. He actually lost by 1 vote. The deciding vote was the President of the Senate, who is, of course, John C. Calhoun. Jackson was so enraged that Calhoun didn't support him that he wrote him off. Jackson, was as much of a hot-headed man as Calhoun was, and there is Van Buren, standing in a great American tradition of almost victimization, of saying, well, here I am. And at this point, he basically becomes anointed as Jackson's successor. And Van Buren had a very close relationship with Jackson. A lot of Jackson's policies were very tempered by what Van Buren said. And Van Buren, basically rose to the position of being the vice president.
In fact, there's a portrait of Andrew Jackson in this room where our set is today. And later on, when we go upstairs, we'll see that right across from the Martin Van Buren's bed as he woke up in the morning is a document with Jackson's picture. So the first thing he saw in the morning when he woke up. Let's take another telephone call from Boston. Good morning, Boston.
Good morning. Thank you for that account of how Mr. Van Buren became Mr. Jackson's protege, Mr. Henderson. And I have a question. I don't know where I encountered it, but somewhere along the line I encountered an idea or suggestion that perhaps Martin Van Buren was the illegitimate son of Aaron Burr. Have you discussed that yet?
We did at the outset, and it is from the novel by Gore Vidal. Real quick.
Burr. The title of the novel is Burr, and it's written by Gore Vidal, and it's a wonderful historical novel. But it's just that, it's an historical novel, and there's not really there's no documentary evidence to give it any credence, but it's a great story.
We'll return to Patricia West, who is on the basement, and we're learning more about the life of the servants at Lindenwold, Van Buren's estate. Where are you now?
Susan, I'm standing now in the kitchen of the house, and here we try to suggest a little bit about what labor went behind the fabulous banquets in the center hall. We have some props set up, interpretive props that allow us to discuss cooking, food preparation. We have some examples of Van Buren's admiration for the latest technology, including a hand pump here on my left, and also the Moses Pond Union Range, which is directly behind you, Jeff, and that's an example of the latest cooking technology in the middle of the 19th century, which to us looks relatively primitive, but was actually a fairly sophisticated device in Van Buren's day.
Well, let me ask about the homes of the time, because just last week when we were visiting Andrew Jackson's home at the Hermitage, kitchens were detached from the main house because of fires. And why is this kitchen part of the main house?
Well, often even in the Northeast, kitchens were detached. In this case, it's not, and that's not unusual either. It really could be either in vernacular architecture. I often think that it's really fortunate that it's placed so close, considering the amount of labor that it would take to haul the food, which would be hot, and heavy and substantial, from the kitchen all the way upstairs through the servants' dining room where I was standing before into the main hallway. So that, that goes back to what I was saying before about how we do this kind of research, which is we begin with what we know from the documentary record and the material culture record, that, for example, an elaborate meal would have occurred in that space, and then to say what would have had to have happened in this space where I'm standing now, in the kitchen, in order to make that happen. So this is the area that we use to make that dining room make sense. And not just as though the food didn't just sort of appear, but it actually was made. It was made by human beings, and human beings some of whose names we know.
Michael Henderson, from what you can study, what do we know of how he treated his health?
Well, from what we can study, we know basically what they were paid. We know that, of course, we only have his side of the story for them. They're wage workers. They come and go. We know, from his letters, basically we only know the times that he's complained about them. He writes, "There's been a riot in my kitchen today, and the cook has the devil in her eye," and talks about this, kind of feuding that's going on downstairs. And there's the cliche of saying it's hard to get good help, and that that's easy to say that, but riot's a very strong word to use, and I'm sure he wouldn't have used the word riot unless he meant that there was something really serious going on, because just before he took office, there were flower riots in New York City. I mean, he knew what the word riot was. There was a lot of tension going on in this house. These women were working, day and night. They maybe had a half an afternoon off a week. They were miles from anywhere. I mean, Kinderhook's still rural. They were Catholic in a non-Catholic area that had to create some tension. And they were a long way away from home, and they had to deal with all of this stuff in the Van Buren house. That silver plateau that you saw on the dining room table, and all of the fine glassware and elaborate silver. I mean, these generally were young women coming out of rural Western Ireland. What did they know? The difference between a lemon fork and a shrimp fork, and not knowing that could get them in a lot of trouble with him, because he would mess up their ritual, and the ritual of dining was a very important one, and he wanted to be seen as being sophisticated. He wore fine clothes. He always had fine things, because it was important for him to be seen that way.
We'll return to Patricia West as our program continues from Lindenwold. We will listen next to a caller from Oceanside, California. Oceanside, good morning. You're on the air.
Hi. I was just watching the TV. I was just looking through the TV, and I seen you all talking about Martin Van Buren. And I did see the Amistad movie. It was very painful and very sad to watch. I am of African descent, and I'm really happy that you guys were talking about some of the issues of slavery, and I do believe they do need to be addressed in America, and that's why America needs a lot. America does have a lot of healing to do, and until slavery is addressed, I believe that America will continue to be the way it is right now. And whenever I do see the different plantations and different houses that were used in the plantation times, I think of houses of torture. To me, it's like glorifying a concentration camp.
I understand your comment, but I think it's important to retain these places, to have that discussion, in the sense that if we get rid of all of the evidence that anything ever happened, it sort of ceases to be real. Now, Van Buren didn't own slaves here in this house, and he certainly, after he had inherited slaves from his father's estate, he was rid of them quite quickly. But wage labor was also very hard, certainly not the evil that slavery is, and in no way am I an apologist for Martin Van Buren. But it's important to have that discussion. And it's important to talk about slavery here in the North. I mean, we often go to southern plantations where we talk about slavery, or we talk about slavery in the South or in Washington. It's important to talk about slavery here. Kinderhook was a large slaveholding community. When Martin Van Buren was a young man, Kinderhook was one of the largest slave-owning communities in New York State, outside of New York City. And it's important to remember that. And I think that it's sometimes hard to take people through a beautiful historic house museum and talk about these ugly things, but it's these very ugly things that help support this beautiful lifestyle. You kind of can't save one without the other, and it's important to have that conversation.
Over calls, we'll continue looking around in the basement of this house, which is open to tour when you come to visit. The house is open for the season in about 2 weeks here, so if you're visiting this part of New York State, you're most welcome to visit Lindenwold. And as we look, we will listen to La Crescenta, California.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
First of all, thank you to C-SPAN for a great series. And having roots in Kentucky, I'm kind of interested in Martin Van Buren's vice president, Richard M. Johnson. I believe he was from Kentucky, wasn't he?
I believe he was.
Yes. Could you tell us anything about him and what was his relationship with Van Buren? And I'll hang up and listen to the answer.
Politically, he was a Jeffersonian Democrat. They were basically aligned in that respect, although he was a Westerner. That was the West at this time. And he basically was, he was connected with Andrew Jackson. He was kind of selected for the ticket to balance in that great need in the Democratic Party to keep that balance between North and South, keep the balance between slave and non-slave and Western and Eastern. He was sort of selected to pick the ticket. He did become somewhat controversial. He had inherited a mulatto slave, Celia, from his father, whom he had a very long-term and loving relationship with. He did have children from that union and was often ridiculed in the press for that. So, you know, it sort of brings it home up close and personal. He also had a tendency to have unusual beliefs about things and tried to sponsor odd pieces of legislation, exploratory missions out of the country. And I don't know that Van Buren always thought that he was right on target with him, but I know that he was his vice president at the time.
Bridgeport, Connecticut, you're next on Martin Van Buren.
Good morning, Susan and Michael. Listen, I read a short biography on Martin Van Buren, and in 1831, he resigned as Secretary of State to become minister to Great Britain. But in January of 1832, however, the Senate rejected the appointment. Could you expand a little on why his appointment was rejected by the Senate?
Oh, sure.
Thank you very much.
His appointment was rejected by the Senate by one vote, and very consciously, and the one vote was the tie-breaking vote of the President of the Senate, who, of course, is the seated Vice President, John C. Calhoun. Calhoun thought that this was his opportunity to finally get rid of Van Buren. Calhoun was much more extreme in his state rights views. There had been lots of kind of bad blood at this point between Calhoun and Van Buren, and Calhoun thought that this was the way to just kill Van Buren once and for all. Van Buren had already traveled to Europe. He was already in England, a minister plenipotentiary to the court of St. James. He's the ambassador to Great Britain, the most important position, the most important ambassadorial position. And what happens is that Andrew Jackson doesn't take this well. He's nominated Martin Van Buren for this position, and he is, he's quite upset, to say the least, about this vote in the Senate. And in effect, what happens is Calhoun shoots his own career in the foot. It's interesting that there's a very famous series of quotes that come on the Jefferson Day dinner in 1830. And this was a dinner that was held in honor of Thomas Jefferson. And basically, Calhoun jumps up and raises a toast. It says, "Our Union, next to our liberty, is most dear." Jackson, of course, being the president at the time and the strong, powerful president he is, stands up and says, "Our Union, it must be preserved. Our federal Union must be preserved." At this point, you've got two guys who are on opposite sides of the spectrum. Van Buren, who's always the compromiser, who was supposedly so short that he couldn't be seen, stands up on a chair and says, "Mutual forbearance and reciprocal concessions," and basically implying that through these auspices of compromise on all sides, that is the way that the Union was created. That's the only way the Union's going to survive. And it's interesting to see Calhoun being so extreme here again with this vote on Van Buren's nomination to the Court of St. James that he basically has blown himself out of the water.
A call next from Boulder, Colorado. Boulder, are you there? Sounds like we lost that call. And we're going to take advantage of this little break right now to take a break. We still have 90 minutes ahead, and we'll be back after some information about Martin Van Buren and this series to talk more about this House and the 8th President of the United States. And on your television set right now is Lindenwold. Michael Henderson, what's Lindenwold?
Lindenwold is the home of the 8th President of the United States, Martin Van Buren.
Located where?
Located in Kinderhook, New York, or just south of Kinderhook, New York.
And where is Kinderhook?
Kinderhook is just south of Albany on the east side of the Hudson. It's a very early Dutch settlement in the Hudson Valley.
It is a National Park Service site open for your visits in the middle of May. And we are here this morning to learn more about the life and times of Martin Van Buren, our country's 8th president, a man who served as vice president before succeeding Andrew Jackson to the presidency. And I wanted to ask you your very favorite Martin Van Buren story, for good or ill.
My very favorite Martin Van Buren story. I would have to say that it was one time when Martin Van Buren was thrown from his horse, and he's an older man. He's 75 or 76 years old at this point. Thrown from his horse in a riding accident, breaks his arm, and is kind of knocked unconscious. And what he says is, "Doesn't that speak well of my head?" And he hadn't broken his head. I suppose he was thick-headed in some respects, but quite savvy in others.
How long did he live?
He lived to be 79 and a half years old, basically. He died in July. His birthday was in December.
And it is worth noting he was the first man elected to the presidency who was actually born a citizen of the United States. All the others born before the American Revolution. So, number of firsts with Martin Van Buren, and we're learning more about them as we spend 2.5 hours in Kinderhook, New York at his home, which is now a historic site. Next call is from Madison, Wisconsin. Good morning, Madison.
Good morning. A fascinating show. I want to know whether Martin Van Buren had any connection with Alexis de Tocqueville. Was he interviewed by him, or I know de Tocqueville was there in 1831, and
I cannot imagine that he wasn't, but I don't really remember. You know, it's been a long time since I've read Democracy in America, and I don't remember Van Buren specifically mentioning it. But you know, he was at the height of his political career at that time. I find it hard to believe that he wasn't in some way, you know, in some way connected with de Tocqueville.
Alexis de Tocqueville stopped in Albany around the 4th of July on his 1831-32 tour, learning about American democracy.
Mm-hmm.
So interesting to see how these lives sometimes parallel. Next call is from Los Angeles, and you are welcome. You're on the air.
Yeah, my name is Dan Du Bois, and I was wondering if you, if the Michael has ever been up to the Catskills up in on Huguenot Street.
Oh, sure.
Okay, my family. I come from one of the Du Bois's that happened to settle that area. Our houses up there actually have cannons up in the attic. And the kitchens are on the basement, which we've turned into a restaurant nowadays. I was wondering, you guys were talking about the kitchens, how odd it is to have that kitchen in the house. Well,
but it's not terribly odd.
In the mountains.
It's a risk.
Up there.
Kitchens catch on fire all the time. Women wearing dresses catch on fire all the time in kitchens. So, I mean, kitchens were a dangerous place. And having kitchens separated from the house was not uncommon. Bringing kitchens into the house was also not that uncommon. You find both, but in the houses where the kitchen's inside, you quickly find things like you have here in Lindenwold, the 1843 installation of the cook stove and actually central heating on the north side of the house was a reaction to that, and you very quickly find a lot of technical innovations. And you see a lot of them in this house. It's interesting to me from the servant's point of view that the technological innovations are running water for the flush toilet, running water for the tub, you find a cook stove, basically to keep the house from burning down. You find central heating on the north side of the house, but no dumbwaiter. Why invest in a dumbwaiter when we have, you know, we have wage servants to be running this stuff around? So it's interesting to look at where the money was put in technology.
You said technology was central heating. How warm does the house get in winter with central heating?
Oh, warm enough to keep your coat on, I would say. We try to keep the house to 50 degrees because we actually heat through the historic heating ducts. The historic heat was a coal-driven a gravity-fed furnace, which is on the north side of the house. And I think you can see right now on the monitor there, you see some of the heating ducts. It's interesting that the heating ducts go into some of the public rooms, but not into Martin Van Buren's bedroom, which implies that he was just sort of living it the old-fashioned way with fireplaces.
And how cold would it have been for him waking up in the morning in the wintertime without heating in his part of the house.
Well, it would have been quite cold for him. It's cold here. It would have been colder for those servants, though, because they're sleeping in the attic. There's no furnace outlet. There's no fireplaces. There's nothing up there. So I suppose you might think, as an employer, it's a good way to keep people moving. Not give them any heat. They'll jump up and run around. But it can be quite cold here in the winter. You know, we have sub-zero temperatures for a couple of weeks in February.
And in fact, the house is closed for a couple of months during the very coldest part of the winter.
That's quite true.
Katy, Texas. Good morning.
Yes, this is for Mr. Henderson. In the election of 1844, what machinations were involved behind the scenes to deprive Van Buren of the Democratic nomination in favor of James K. Polk? What was going on? As I recall, Clay and Van Buren had made a gentleman's agreement not to exacerbate the Western expansion issue in that campaign, and then when the convention came about, Polk got the nomination.
That's true.
What was going on?
Thank you for the question. And just to put it into a lineage of history, Martin Van Buren was defeated after just one term in office, came here, and began plotting his political comeback.
That's quite correct. And in 1844, Van Buren basically went into the Democratic nomination, the committee meeting. Basically, he assumed that he had the nomination tied up. He was the heir apparent. He was basically the leader of the Democratic Party. But he got kind of caught up in a question about the annexation of Texas. And this Texas question had been floating back and forth for a long time. And there were a lot of issues associated with Texas. Of course, the extension of slavery into a new territory. But there were also debts associated with Texas. Van Buren was concerned that if we annex Texas too quickly, we might go to war with Mexico. He wrote a very long position paper, almost like a state paper, the Hammett letter, where he talks about how legally the United States federal government is to treat territories. And this letter kind of got out before the convention. It was published, and although Van Buren was seen in the convention as not supporting the annexation of Texas, it's not exactly true. He was not supporting the immediate annexation of Texas, and what happens is he loses the floor fight. Basically, in the Democratic Convention, he loses the floor fight, and James K. Polk, who's much more hot-headed Westerner, who's very supportive of the annexation of Texas, wins. And Andy Jackson kind of supports Polk at this point as well. And Van Buren feels, I think, a little hard done to, because he really expected the blessings of his party. This is a party he worked years to create and to hold together, and a party that he believed would hold the Union together. And he really thought that this annexation of Texas was a hot-headed thing and might roll us into war with Mexico, and indeed it did. I think he felt very cheated by this nomination, although he didn't give up the ship. He certainly comes back in 1848, but even on a different tack. By 1848, more stuff has gone on. The southern wing of the Democratic Party has really become beholden to slave power, and that's basically how it is described. That the very delicate balance of power in the Democratic Party between the Northerners and the urban Irish immigrant populations and the Southern slaveholders is beginning to crumble. Each side is becoming more polarized, and the Southern slaveholders are becoming so strong within the Democratic Party that they basically make the question of the extension of slavery and indeed slavery in the new territories kind of litmus test. Much the way the modern Republican Party has a plank in its party that is anti-abortion. The Democratic Party basically accepts a plank that is for the annexation of Texas. And when you create those types of political litmus tests, you kind of polarize the issue and the party. So by 1848, Van Buren has basically moved on. He's never willing to renege his party membership. I think it means too much to him personally. He spent his whole life creating the Democratic Party. I think he's not willing to give it up, but he is willing to put his name in the ring for something that his son, John Van Buren, is very interested in, which is this coalition of Free Liberty, or the Free Soil Party and the Liberty Party, and the barn burners, who are basically the wing of the Democratic Party, who are so interested in getting the slaveholders out of the party that they're willing to burn the barn down to get rid of the rats.
So he came back and made another try for a non-successive term under a different party label, the Free Soil Party. What other presidents in American history have made similar bids?
It's an interesting question. Theodore Roosevelt is the one who leaps to mind with the Bull Moose Party. Of course, you know, he had been out of office. Basically, he kind of turned down the Republican nomination, but Roosevelt becomes disenchanted with the way with where the Taft administration is going and where the Republican Party is going, and he runs again on the Bull Moose ticket. Van Buren's doing much the same thing. I think in Van Buren's case, he gives it a lot of thought. His son, John Van Buren, who becomes Attorney General of the state of New York, is really on the anti-slavery side. I think Van Buren has moved that way, and he's willing to accept the nomination in 1848 because he thinks that it's time to draw the line in the sand. You know, he's been a compromiser his entire life. The issue becomes, how far can you compromise? You know, if you're going to dance with the devil, how long are you going to do it? And in that respect, I think Van Buren in 1848, that's his last chance. His last chance to make a statement about how he thinks his vision of keeping the Union together is.
Albuquerque, New Mexico, you are next. Good morning.
Hi, I'm a teacher, and we use your website, American Presidents, in class.
Wonderful.
I'm also homeschooling my son, and he's reading the Encyclopedia of Presidents, the Children's Press Chicago series, and as we get to a president, he reads the book just before that. And anyway, I'm also interested in getting my students involved in that profile contest that you have. As a resident of New Mexico with a large native population, can you tell us about Van Buren's views and policies concerning Native Americans? And also, I'd like to know more about Van Buren as a potato farmer.
Okay. Well, as a potato farmer, he was very successful. As a politician with an Indian policy, he had a little more difficult road to travel. As you know, the Indian question and Indian removal became a big issue during the Jackson administration. Jackson was wholeheartedly for the removal of Indians. Jackson believed that, you know, they had to go. Van Buren didn't grow up in the West. He grew up in the East. The Indians were already gone from the Northeast, so it was very easy to have a slightly softer position on Native Americans because they weren't here. And during, you know, from 1830, when the legislation is passed for Indian removal, through the actual removal, which is during the Van Buren administration, it's 1838. It's another one of those. It's one of those nasty things that's being done. The removal and the Trail of Tears was. You know, of course, it wasn't intended to be as harsh as it was, but it was harsh. I mean, you know, these people were basically exterminated. They were walked to death. It is a terrible thing. Van Buren speaks about Indian removal in many of his speeches in a kind of Jeffersonian way, that if we remove the Indians, it will help them be preserved. You know, that's sort of a lame argument, except when you look at the tribes that still survive, they're basically the tribes that were removed, or that were at least given the opportunity to be removed. You don't find the East Coast tribes, you know, the Pequots are gone, you know, but the Seminoles and the Cherokees and the Crees do somewhat survive. It's a very difficult time, and it's a difficult policy.
Continuing with classroom education, each week in this series we are finding a school named after the featured president and talking with either teachers or students there about what they know about the president. Right now you're going to hear Jane Miller, who is a media specialist here in Kinderhook, New York at Martin Van Buren Elementary School. Ms. Miller, good morning.
Good morning.
Can you tell us, here you are in Martin Van Buren's hometown, but you have young children that you teach. What do you tell them about their namesake president?
Well, we try to help them learn about Martin Van Buren, and we try to tell them a lot. The New York State social studies curriculum focuses at the 4th grade level on local history and local government. So here at Martin Van Buren School, which is a school of 3rd and 4th graders, we spend a lot of time on local history, and Martin Van Buren has a very important place in this curriculum. Basically, we do a lot of teaching with the help of the National Park Service and the people at Lindenwald. We participate in field trips. Many times park rangers visit our school and give lessons on Martin Van Buren, especially prior to the Martin Van Buren gravesite birthday celebration. We also have done a number of projects with Lindenwold and the park rangers there, and the students have had a real opportunity, a wonderful opportunity to visit the site many times and to be able to use the resources that are there.
Can you tell me a typical question that a third or fourth grader would ask about Martin Van Buren?
Well, they probably would want to know what was he like and what was it like for him living in Kinderhook. You know, did he experience, of course, the activities were different, but did he have some of the same kinds of childhood experiences that they did? They're really fascinated with a person's life. The social history of our country is fascinating, and children tend to want to know about what the person was really and truly like. So probably that would be the question.
What's a story that you like to tell about Martin Van Buren, or a question you might have for Michael Henderson?
Well, I think the story that one of the stories we tell is really about his childhood growing up in Kinderhook. And we like to talk about the fact that really Martin Van Buren and this country, as it began, they began together. And we like to talk about the fact that as a young boy, he came from a regular family. He had chores to do. He worked in his father's tavern. I'm sure he tried to sneak out many times and go play with his friends, and he did a lot of the things that kids today like to do. But one of the things that he really enjoyed was listening to all of the patrons speak about what was going on in the new country. And we like to talk about the fact that he had an intense interest in this and how important it is to develop interest. So I think that's a story we like to tell about Martin Van Buren working in the tavern. And probably if Michael came to visit, they would probably would ask what would be important. What does he think would be important? What would Martin Van Buren would tell them would be important in order to be successful in life?
Well, we hope that there are other third and fourth grade teachers around the country who are watching this and might be inspired, even if they don't live here locally. What can you tell them about important things to learn about Martin Van Buren's presidency? If they, again, teach young people, but they're not right here.
As a president, what could we tell them? Well, first of all, we would probably, I think we would probably try to talk to them about the importance of citizenship and community. And I think Martin Van Buren is a wonderful model of citizenship. He came from a what we would probably consider a middle-class family today. He worked very hard. He was very studious. He had goals, and he gave his life to public service. It's very apparent that he did. And he also probably part of the reason for his success was because of the support he got from his community. And I think the concept of community is a very important one to teach the children. We all celebrate community when we, all of us, we get into our Ichabod Crane buses and we travel down to the grave site, and together we have representatives from the village, from the town, from the state, and the representative from the president, as well as the National Park Service. Along with all of us from Martin Van Buren School, we celebrate his life, and each of us has a chance to stand up and talk about Martin Van Buren, and we all do. And there is a way, that's one way in which community supports one another and teaches one another. So I think probably those two things we would try to instill or talk to teachers about, telling about the fact that these two concepts of citizenship and community probably apply to many of the presidents that we learn about today.
We have a website for teachers that if you would like to learn more about teaching, there are lots of resources available. Ours is just one of them. But we will put the information on the screen. If you are a classroom teacher or a homeschooler, it's cspan.org/classroom is the address. You can also dial in and talk to our education services staff at 202-626 4858, and they will direct you to the educational materials that we have developed about all our American presidents, all 41 men who served in the presidency. Jane Miller, thank you very much. Here in Kinderhook, New York, locally, at the Martin Van Buren Elementary School, we appreciate your special perspectives on teaching young people about our 8th president.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us this morning. Well, she talked about public service, but let me ask you the tough question. What drove Martin Van Buren? Was it an interest in serving the public or an interest in having power?
I think it was an interest in serving the public. I mean, he certainly starts out his career as a lawyer, and something that his mother was interested in. He was always somewhat uncomfortable with the fact that he'd basically only been schooled formally to the age of 14. He then was apprenticed in a lawyer shop and basically read for the law. Although he passed the bar by the time he was 21 years old, he always in his career felt a little uncomfortable about his formal education. But his interest in politics was pretty early on. And I don't know that it was necessarily a search for power as much as it was a search for power to do good. And to continue this experiment in American democracy.
Important at this point to also note one biography that I read suggested that he helped develop New York's first political machine.
Yes, the Albany Regency, as you'll often see it referred to, is really the first formal political machine in the country. Basically, New York State was split into 4 districts at the time, and what Van Buren did while he was in the state assembly and a state senator is ensure that the party would be in Albany for votes, a critical thing when you're trying to get, when you're trying to keep an agenda. It's just making sure people show up. And also that there's a kind of political orthodoxy. These are the values that first he defined what's the old Republicans, but basically what the Democrats were. He defined, the first time a party actually defined what they were, they had a platform and they actually showed up for votes. So that's basically the core of what the Albany Regency was. But what it allowed him to do as a politician was to say, I can deliver New York State. I can have this. So it gave him a lot of clout and a lot of power to bargain with.
Martin Van Buren is described as the first professional politician to be elected to the presidency. Many certainly followed in his path after.
George Bush being a famous one.
Laurel, Maryland, you are on the air.
Yes. Good morning.
Good morning.
I was wondering if I'm from the state of Maine originally, and I was wondering if you could speak on the border disputes that occurred with Canada during the Van Buren administration.
Sure.
Answer. Thank you.
There were a couple of them. There's the Caroline affair. Basically, Canada, Upper Canada and Lower Canada were somewhat in revolt. There was an American ship with an American on it that was sunk in the Niagara River. There was an arrest. Subsequently, a Canadian or a British citizen was in Buffalo, sort of boasting about the fact that he had helped sink the ship. He was immediately arrested. There was a border conflict there. Certainly in Maine, with the Aroostook War, the border between Maine and Great Britain hadn't been well established. These were all opportunities, particularly in Maine, because the people in Maine basically took the valley for the U.S. There were a lot of opportunities for an engagement, and to go back to war with Great Britain wasn't going to be a good thing, and Van Buren knew that. He'd certainly been through the War of 1812, although we have our victories from the War of 1812. We also had a whole lot of defeats, including the burning of the White House. So I think it was important, the Van Buren administration, to keep us out of war with Great Britain. And the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, which finally settled the border between Maine and Canada, although that wasn't during the Van Buren administration, it was subsequently, his efforts towards that treaty, I think, were pretty important.
Michael Henderson is the superintendent of this National Park Service site. About how many staff do you have working here?
Well, to be a full-time bureaucrat, I'll tell you, we have 14 full-time equivalents. That works out to being a couple of people in the winter and a large seasonal staff, because our operation is basically seasonal, a lot of seasonal park rangers.
Today, by the way, is one of the training days for the new rangers on site. They open up in about 2 weeks here for your visit, and we hope along the way that many of you will come out to visit some of the historic sites associated with our presidents.
Please do.
Next call is from Concord, California.
Hi, my name is Bill DePross. I lived there at Lindenwald from
1957.
And so I know a great deal about the property. And by the way, you might spend a minute talking about the hot air circulation of that fireplace between you.
Okay.
My question is in regard to the purchase of Lindenwold. I'm quoting from Stokinger's documentary that he did for you folks in 1981, that he purchased the property from a General William Paulding in 1839.
That's correct.
Now, I happen to have heard somewhere that there was a William Paulding was his Secretary of the Navy, and I've always wondered if there was some kind of connection or some kind of intrigue there that I'll make you Secretary of the Navy if you give me your house, or something like that.
And sir, your family lived here at Lindenwold?
Yes,
my family owned the property from 1917 till 1957.
And you personally lived here?
I lived there from 1930 till 1957. I owned that 5-acre lawn you're looking at right now.
Lots of memories. What is your favorite place in the house?
I think the tower.
Good place for a young man to go out and...
We used to go up there when there was... I'm getting emotional.
Oh, I'm sure you've got lots of memories here.
Yeah.
I think just playing hide-and-go-seek in this house as a kid must have been fabulous.
Oh, yeah.
With all the staircases and hidden places.
Yes. I could go through the whole place in the dark, even right now.
Well, thank you very much. What a very special perspective to have on this house. I appreciate your taking time to call in this morning.
Just let me say something about James Kirk Paulding, who Martin Van Buren purchased the house from. He was also the mayor of New York City and also owned a house down the river called Lyndhurst, which is an Alexander Jackson Davis house. He is related to the Paulding in the Navy, in the cabinet, but they're not directly the same person. So there was no quid pro quo. I'll make you a cabinet member if you sell me your house. And actually, James Kirk Paulding owned Lindenwold kind of as an absentee landlord. No one had really lived in Lindenwold for several years, and the place had fallen into great disrepair. And one of the things Van Buren did when he first came to Lindenwold was to clean up the place. The exterior and the gardens had fallen into disrepair. He put a lot of effort into pleasure grounds. He had greenhouses and hothouses. He had 2 fish ponds created because he liked to fish and they could stock the ponds. And most of his aesthetic decisions also had a very practical side to them. I think you can see now on the monitor an artist's rendering of the Lindenwold estate around 1850, which is after the Richard Upjohn addition was added. Richard Upjohn designed the tower and the gables as well. And you can see Lindenwold was run as a working farm. You can see the sheep there. You can see gardens off to the background. While he was running for president up through the 1840s, he always had a farm manager. After that, he actually ran the farm himself. He was very interested in the agriculture, and he had very political motivations for purchasing Lindenwold. This is an urban guy, always well-dressed. I mean, he came from a rural background, but for most of his political career, he's a mover and a shaker in Washington. He realizes during his presidency that he's espousing all of these Jeffersonian agrarian values, but he hasn't engaged in them himself. So he actually buys the farm, and he picks out what he thinks is the best property that he knew in his hometown when he was a kid, and he buys it, and he fixes it up, and he spends the next 21 years of his life here. And in 1850, in the census, he lists his occupation as a farmer, which I think is real neat.
We are going to continue our tour of the house in just a second. We should establish a bit about family life for Martin Van Buren here. He came back here after the presidency, and he was a widower in the White House, so no hostess here as well?
Van Buren's wife died in 1819 after 12 years of marriage, Hannah Hoos. They had 5 children, one who died in infancy, Winfield Scott Van Buren, for the Trivial Pursuit fanatics out there. But he had 5 kids who grew to maturity, and they were a very close family. When he came back to Lindenwold, his son Abraham and his wife Angelica Singleton, who has served as Van Buren's hostess at the White House, came here, and especially in the early 40s she spends a great deal of time here. She writes wonderful letters to her mother in South Carolina saying, "Send me a list of everything you need to run a proper household with. This house has suffered under months of bachelor misrule." So that's always one of my favorite quotes of Angelica. But he was very much a family man. Like George Bush, his family referred to him as Poppy. He had grandchildren who he adored. He loved spending time with his grandchildren. And he was very much a family man. And all of the sons and their spouses had favorite bedrooms and had bedrooms, that were theirs to come and stay in.
Dr. Patricia West is the curator here at Van Buren's National Historic Site. And last week we saw that Andrew Jackson was a very aggrieved widower and thought often of his wife Rachel. When you look at the artifacts in this house, do you see any evidence of Hannah?
It's interesting that you should bring that up because we recently acquired an object, which I believe we'll see a little bit later on, that really tells us a lot about the extent to which Van Buren really remained attached to his wife's family, even though she died so very young. We'll be looking at an artifact that was a gift of Van Buren's niece, who was the niece of Hannah Hoos, to him on his 70th birthday, a gift of a Bible, and we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of the program. So the families remain close, and you know, because Hannah died so young, it fell on her relatives to raise the younger boys. So it was a very they remained very enmeshed despite Hannah's early death. You know, I'm really glad that Michael mentioned how peopled the house was. That's something that our interpreters really work hard to communicate, because it's a museum now and it's very still, but it was full of sons and daughters-in-law and little children pointing out the rabbits in the central hall wallpaper and squealing with delight, and so it was a very lively household. He was not a lonely bachelor, however he may have misruled. And the room that I'm seated in now kind of relates to the bachelor misrule quotation, because this is, I have here a seat of honor in Martin Van Buren's library. And although I'm very comfortable here now, I think it's important to say I would not have been so comfortable here in the 19th century simply because I'm female. This is a very gendered space, and we've installed this room to suggest to the visitors what some of these gentlemanly activities would have been. After your fabulous banquet in the dining hall, or after your visit with your charming grandchildren, if you did have the urge to withdraw, and you were a gentleman, this is where you would come. We have a game of whist going on at a card table here. We have Van Buren's writing desk, which is installed to show you how Van Buren could have received political visitors and had discussions with them. Of course, we have some of the artifacts related to the fact that suggests that Martin Van Buren was not a temperance advocate, as were most of the Whigs, his political opponents. We have some Madeira, of which he was quite fond, and some punch cups sitting on the table. Of course, Van Buren's, some portions of Van Buren's extensive library of books. Many of these books are not originally Van Buren's, but we do need to suggest a full library, because Van Buren was always expanding his library and always educating himself. Of course, he had no formal education. But he was self-educated, loved the Waverley novels, had a full legal library that he purchased as a young man and continually enlarged, and also collected the works of American authors. And it's important to remember that some of the great writers of the 19th century, Hawthorne, Melville, Walt Whitman, were all profoundly associated with the Democratic Party, and particularly with Van Buren's earlier career in the 30s.
And Washington Irving was, of course, a close associate as well. So.
And somewhat of a neighbor.
Yes.
Next is a call from Walton, New York. Walton, you're on the air. Welcome.
Hello.
Hi.
This is James Van Buren. I know Michael.
How do you do?
And I'm not directly descended from the president. In fact, as Michael knows, nobody with the surname Van Buren can claim direct descent. I guess collateral descent is the word. But I'm very curious about Michael saying that the Roosevelts and Van Buren share a common ancestor. I didn't know that.
Yes.
And then a second question, not related to the descendancy, is that there's a fascinating story about why Calhoun was dismissed by Jackson, which was the famous, you touched on it, which was the famous Peggy Eaton affair,
yes.
And how it affected the wives of the cabinet. In fact, I think Calhoun's wife spent most of the time in South Carolina. She was so upset about the Peggy Eaton thing. And incidentally, many years ago when Edward R. Murrow was doing You Are There, he did a sequence on that famous story. Hello, Michael.
Yeah, hi, how are you? The Eaton affair is interesting. Van Buren referred to it sometimes as the Eaton fever, or Eaton malaria. To set the stage for you, John Eaton, who was one of Van Buren's cabinet members.
Jackson's.
I'm just sorry. Yeah, one of Jackson's cabinet members. Basically married a young woman who was from Washington, whose name I will call her Margaret Eaton because she called herself Margaret Eaton. She was very much scandalized by other members of the Jackson cabinet. One of the reasons that Van Buren and Jackson engineered the whole dismissal or the whole resignation of the first cabinet during the first Jackson administration was to try to clear Calhoun and clear this mess up. But basically, Margaret Eaton was a young woman who was living in, she was living a forthright and upstanding type of way in a period when women were expected to remain in the women's sphere. This is a period when we have the woman question. What is the role of women? And, you know, here's a young woman who speaks her mind. Here's a young woman who, you know, has no gumptions about doing any of that. And is very much acting, you put quotes around it, in a masculine fashion, and is relating to, you know, in a masculine world, and very much resented and detested by other cabinet members' wives, particularly Calhoun's wife. You know, they basically implied that she was a slut. And if you look at the historiography of Margaret Eaton from then until very recently with the new book, The Petticoat Affair, you basically see Peggy Eaton sort of branded as being this loose woman. And, you know, Peggy Eaton's problem was that she was, in some ways, liberated in an area and in a social elevation where she couldn't be. And the Eaton affair really backfired again on Calhoun. Calhoun keeps getting stuck in these terrible positions. Calhoun's wife detested Peggy Eaton. The other cabinet members wouldn't entertain her. They wouldn't be seen with her. Van Buren, of course, is a bachelor. It's very easy for Van Buren to be polite and cordial. It's his nature to begin with. And he sees no problem with entertaining Eaton, and both Mr. and Mrs. Eaton. And Jackson, of course, who's still bitter and hurt over his wife Rachel's death, and feeling that Rachel's death was brought on prematurely by people who maligned her because of her not quite divorce and then marriage to Jackson. Jackson, you know, being the gallant fellow that he is and believing in womanly virtues and defending this woman, Jackson feels that Mrs. Eaton's being hard done to, and there's Van Buren taking up Mrs. Eaton's cause. So Van Buren is in a position of also looking like a gentleman, and supporting, you know, this woman who's being much maligned by these bickering women, these bickering cabinet wives women. So Van Buren, you know, Van Buren, the little magician, manages to pull this one off as well. So it's a fascinating story about political intrigue. And one of my favorite quotes about the Eaton affair is Parton, who's an historian in 1861, says, and I'll try to quote it, that the last 30 years of political history in this country can be traced to the moment when the soft hand of Mr. Van Buren touched Mrs. Eaton's knocker. Double entendre, not to be lost. Sexual scandals were, you know, they're not new. The Lewinsky affair is a new twist on it, perhaps, but sexual scandals aren't new. They affect the way the way a government can react, and they affect the ability of a president to be effective sometimes.
And Mr. Henderson referenced the book published about this just last year called The Petticoat Affair, still available in bookstores.
Great book.
And it is a book which gave rise to the Van Buren presidency, which is what we are talking about this morning. Martin Van Buren, our 8th president of the United States. Boulder, Colorado, your question about Martin Van Buren.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for taking this call. I love the love the picture of the long, elegant dining room table in the hall, and all this elegant accoutrement or whatever it is. Anyway, I wonder where the guests came from. I would think that Troy and Albany were too far away for coming by carriage, and so I just wondered how often he had big dinner parties and where they came from, and where the family ate when they were just small people and breakfast and so forth. So I'll get off the line, let you answer. Thank you.
Thank you. May we let Patricia,
Sure.
Patricia West, answer that question?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
The question is about the dining room table. Where did the guests come from? Because the distances were so far in those days.
You know, it really amazes me when I read accounts of the 19th century in general, in this house in particular, how far people really did come. People did travel, and you know, of course, some of the cities that you were mentioning, Albany, there was quite a good deal of river travel in this period, and there's easy access by way of the river. You know, we're right along the Hudson River, as is Albany. But also there's, you know, we have the old post road out in front of the house that you know, that was very well traveled. If you read the guest list of Lindenwold, you'll find that people came from far and wide. I believe Michael mentioned Thomas Hart Benton and Henry Clay, who were not exactly neighbors.
The caller's second question was, where did the family eat on an everyday basis?
Well, I believe we'll be showing you the room which is immediately to your west, behind you, Susan. That's referred to in family correspondence as the breakfast room. And as you'll see, it's very much cozier, smaller room that has immediate access to the basement area where I was standing before. And that's where a small family dining event would have occurred, although we did mention the extent to which the house was very well peopled. So I suspect that central dining table was used simply because of the number of family members. It was used not just for those formal events, but also for the larger family dinners as well.
For those students of period furniture, what is the period of the furniture in this house?
Most of the furniture in the house is you know, as you saw in the Hermitage, is what's referred to as Empire furniture. Also a lot of Gothic Revival furniture, and then here and there some slightly earlier pieces. Although we work very hard in the house to try, you know, it's very exciting to people who love decorative arts and antiques to be in this house because they're such lovely things. But we work very hard to try to keep the focus on Martin Van Buren rather than these fabulous things. When you come visit us, you'll see that our interpreters are very, very deft in relating, you know, each individual thing or the things in general in the period room exhibits to the life of Martin Van Buren here at Lindenwold.
We're hearing lots from people with connections, and our next caller has one as well. The call is from Bradenton, Florida. Hello, Bradenton.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, it's Jean Akers.
Ah, hi, Jeannie.
Who am I talking to?
Michael Henderson.
Oh, Mike, I didn't know I was on right now. I still heard them. Michael, I want to say hello from warm and sunny Florida. We'll be up in 2 weeks. Are those dandelions growing in the front lawn?
Oh, they're healthier than ever. You'll be amazed at how shaggy the lawn looks.
I think, Michael, I, like my brother who just called in a minute ago, my grandfather bought this place in 1917, and we did have wonderful childhood memories of hiding in what we called the dungeon, and I think you people have decided it was outside stairway in the back of the house.
Uh-huh.
But I also wanted to, when you go back to the hallway again, and if ever anybody goes there, remember to tell them that horsehair couch out there was one of the original pull-out couches that made a double bed. And another thing that's interesting is when you get upstairs in his bedroom, his own private desk, you pull out the drawer, and there is a secret compartment inside there in the side.
Oh, I certainly will. If we can, I think we'll probably be seeing the hall again. We've had a couple of comments about it. Certainly the dining table is relatively unusual. It's an older piece. Yes,
I went through all that excitement. But the dining hall table you just showed in the private dining.
Here we go.
There we can see it on camera now, and you're wanting to hear more or
about the sofa at the end of the hall there. Yeah, that sofa is one of the early sofa beds. It's like a convertible. Actually, the front part of it pulls out and it kind of extends down into being a sleigh bed. So it's one of the first kind of rollaway beds. Yes. It's interesting. Angelica Singleton Van Buren, Martin Van Buren's daughter-in-law, had a miscarriage in this house in 1843, and she writes to her mother that she spent 2 weeks resting on the hall sofa. And this is most likely the sofa that she was resting on.
Thank you for that call.
Pat, would you also ask Pat, where did they keep all the glassware and china for those huge banquet occasions?
Jeannie, I'm really surprised that you don't know that. I was going to ask you that. Well, you know, right now in the hallway we have these enormous sideboards that would have been used, you know, both to mediate the flow of food and equipment to the tables and also for storage. But it always fascinates me in houses of this period where you don't have the kind of closets and cupboards that we have now, exactly where they put all this stuff. And I can't help but think that an awful lot of it was out and about, you know.
I think a lot of it was.
Yeah.
I think an important display function of having that stuff was to show that you could afford that material. I mean, you know, one of the functions of a sideboard is not just to store things inside of it, but is to display the good stuff that you've got, so everybody knows what your good stuff is. And like that table, an accordion action table, it's attributed to Duncan Fife. It's a relatively rare design. Thomas Jefferson had a table that was very similar to it, which is an interesting connection with Van Buren. But I think one of the roles of all this stuff is just to show your position in society. I think that's something that was important to Van Buren.
Did Van Buren die a wealthy man?
Yes, Van Buren died a wealthy man. He basically, you know, he was born into a family that was not of no means, but he made a lot of money in land speculation. He made a lot of money with his legal practice. He was a practicing lawyer well through the 20s. He made a good deal of money on that. He had wise investments. He purchased Lindenwold, and it always made a profit. I mean, he basically died pretty well off.
It sounds like he was quite a catch.
You would think so.
Why did he never remarry?
Well, there are, you know, he's an incredibly private person. When you read his autobiography, it's much more telling what he's not talking about than what he is talking about. He also wrote a history of American political parties, but his personal life is pretty private. You know, there are two women that are associated with him. One's a local woman, Margaret Sylvester, who was what we would call at the time, I suppose, a spinster lady at 40. You know, God forbid. He was, you know, in his 60s, and there's talk that there was, you know, that he had asked her to marry him, and she refused, saying that she had, you know, gone on this long as she was, she would remain, and they remained friends. But Van Buren didn't remarry, and I think, you know, we don't know that much about him on that personal side. He doesn't tell us.
I'm getting a note here that one of the special items of note as we talk about some of the wear here is finger bowls. Finger bowls.
Well, of course, just in 1840, the Pennsylvania Congressman Charles Ogle gave a ranting and raving speech to the House of Representatives because Van Buren had requested additional funds for the President's house. You have to remember, the White House was just becoming to be called the White House during the Van Buren administration, but it was still called the President's house. And the finger bowls were the latest rage. Van Buren, who was always on the cutting edge of style, had to have colored finger bowls. And actually, the finger bowls that he ordered, we know that he purchased from his own funds, and they're one of the few pieces of material that actually came from the White House to Lindenwold. But of course, the custom was to, you know, between courses, to dip your fingers in the finger bowls and to clean your fingers off. And there are great stories about Thomas Hart Benton coming here and not quite knowing what those bowls of water were, but waiting to see what his host would do. And after he watched Mr. Van Buren daintily dip his hands in the finger bowls and dry them, he rolled up his sleeves and took a plain old Republican wash. So I think there are fun stories about that.
35 minutes left as we explore the life and times of Martin Van Buren, our 8th president. Next, Tampa, Florida.
Hello.
Hi.
Am I on?
You're on.
Hi. Thank you for taking my call. It's the first time I've ever gotten through, and I love this program. I'm calling because I have two things. A question about the influence of Lindenwold on the book, Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which I had heard that it was actually written about that area. And the other question I have, my husband's family first immigrated to the States, and the first immigrant from Ireland got a job working for the Martin Van Buren family in 1830. And I was just wondering if you could comment on whether or not records are available of employees who worked actually in his tavern as a bartender.
There are hit and miss records. You know, as Dr. West said earlier, we have census records, but that's a snapshot of what happens on any specific day. There are also marriage and courthouse records, but there's no fixed record. You basically have to put it together. It's something we're working on all the time, and I encourage you to bring that information here so that we can plug it in.
Washington Irving.
Washington Irving. Well, this house, which was called Kleinrude when it was built in 1797 by Judge Van Ness, was a standard, a standard colonial house, very fine one. But Washington Irving came here to be the tutor to the Van Ness children. Washington Irving and Martin Van Buren were also friends. They also traveled together in Europe. And Washington Irving's niece, Henrietta Irving, married Smith Thompson Van Buren, so they were even related by marriage. But the stories, of course, of the legend of Sleepy Hollow are the competing stories between Tarrytown and Kinderhook, both communities claiming that they are the origins for the legend of Sleepy Hollow. We know that Irving was in England when he wrote that story, but he was actually in Kinderhook when he wrote the Knickerbocker Tales. So it's quite likely that the history of the legend of Sleepy Hollow is a compilation of quaint Dutchness, which is really a lot of what Washington Irving was doing in capturing the quaint past of Dutch ancestry with Rip Van Winkle and characters like that.
Patricia West, in understanding the man, Martin Van Buren, we hear him often referred to as quite a fine gentleman, a dandy. Our cameras right now are in the restroom, the bathroom of this house. And I would like to have you talk about his rather unusual for the time bathing habits.
Yeah, you're looking at the bathroom of the house, which was a very avant-garde feature. Van Buren commented on it in correspondence. We have it encased now in plexiglass, and that was a decision that we made essentially so that you could get a good view of the artifact, because if we had encased it in wood, as it would have been in the period, you wouldn't get to see this fabulous zinc bathtub that was found on the property when the National Park Service acquired the house and then reinstalled in its place in the bathroom. One of the really interesting things about the technical innovations that you see throughout the house is there's a political connection, because Martin Van Buren was an ardent Jeffersonian and traveled to Monticello to visit Jefferson, was in absolute awe of him, and I'm sure in awe of Monticello, which, as you've seen in the series, is well known for its technical innovations for its period. So I can't help thinking that as Van Buren emulated Jefferson in his political philosophy, he also emulated Jefferson when he installed these, the hand pump, the bathroom in the house. Now, as far as Van Buren's dandyhood, which was contributed to his political defeat, as Michael was saying earlier in the Ogle speech, not only was he called on the carpet, as it were, for his finger bowls, but also for his love of fine clothing, which is very well documented. And partly that arises from the ridicule that he suffered as a young man when he first began his career in law for not having the right things, not dressing appropriately. And he learned very quickly how important appearances were in Jacksonian America, and very quickly adopted the sartorial habits of the people he admired. Jefferson notwithstanding, who was not well known for sartorial splendor. In any case, Van Buren did love fine clothes. He did love beautiful things in every realm. I was just looking through the Library of Congress papers for something else recently and came upon an apothecary list from a Washington pharmacy that he bought an enormous amount of scented powders and tooth powders and other sort of hygienic products, because he really cared very deeply about his appearance, and we do link that to the fact that he was not. Jane Miller referred to him as middle class, and that might be an okay way to think of it. He was not, or even in some ways even less than that in terms of his fitting in to the political culture of his time. So he very rapidly learned what things he should have and how he should look. And for better or worse, that remained his style throughout his life.
St. Louis, Missouri.
Good morning. I just wanted to thank you for the series. I am just so addicted to this. First, I have two questions for you. First, I looked into my encyclopedia in my computer and about Martin Van Buren, and they said something to the effect that his wife was a cousin of his. and I was wondering if you could expand on that.
Sure.
And also, I noticed the flooring in his house looks very similar to that of Andrew Jackson's. I was wondering if it was the same type of thing. I believe in Andrew Jackson's it was some kind of a canvas material that was sort of leading up to what we now have as linoleum. I'll hang up and listen to your answer. Thank you.
Okay, first, yes, Hannah Hoos was a second cousin of Martin Van Buren's. That's not unusual, as he said himself. You know, the last 5 generations of his family were solidly within the Dutch immigrants in the Hudson Valley. So it wasn't that unusual. Well, a second cousin's not that close. As far as the floorings, Van Buren has wall-to-wall Brussels carpets, a looped pile carpet in most of the rooms. At the Hermitage, Andrew Jackson did have a floor cloth, and Martin Van Buren also had highly painted patterned floor cloths here as well. We unfortunately have not had the funds to restore them yet, but we still keep plugging away, and someday I'm sure you'll be able to see highly patterned floor cloths at Lindenwold as well.
Idaho Falls, Idaho, on Martin Van Buren. Paul, are you there?
Hello, hello, hello.
Hello, hello, hello.
This is Idaho Falls.
Well, we are on the air. What's your question?
Oh, I'd just like to say I ran off to turn my television set down, so that's why I was afraid you'd hung up on me. Well, I'd like to say that I think Brian Lamb has provided a wonderful service for the nation in providing C-SPAN, and I think you're doing a beautiful job this morning, Susan, and I think Mr. Henderson's doing a good job. And I'd just like to say that I'd like to say 2 things about Angelica Singleton, Van Buren, and Peggy Eaton, which I would just like to share with your audience. I've written a lot of books about Jacqueline Kennedy, that in the whole White House, her favorite portrait was that of Angelica Singleton, Van Buren, which you have shown, which really is a very, very beautiful portrait of a woman. And Dolly Madison deliberately introduced Angelica Singleton to Abraham Van Buren because they didn't have an official hostess, and she wanted them to have one, and she thought that if Abraham and Angelica hit it off, which they did, that she should be providing your nation with another lovely first lady. And also Dolly Madison figures in this. When Peggy Eaton was only 13 years old, she was in a dancing contest, and with a lot of elegant girls, debutantes, and so on. And Dolly Madison was the judge of it, and she judged that Peggy was the most beautiful and elegant of all these girls, and that was the first piece of limelight that Peggy Eaton experienced. And this was also the first time that all the debutante types and everything got mad at her because they were furious that someone who was just an innkeeper's daughter could win this thing when they all their daughters limelight that Peggy Eaton experienced. And this was also the first time that all the debutante types and everything got mad at her because they were furious that someone who was just an innkeeper's daughter could win this thing. Her maiden name, as I said, was O'Neill. And this, I don't know if this man, Mr. Henderson, knows, or if any of you guys know, but I was reading, oddly enough, a murder mystery, and the heroine of this murder mystery was named Peggy O'Neill, and throughout this murder mystery they kept quoting snatches of a song that they said was written in the 19th century, and she had kind of a twinkly eye, and I can't remember it, I'm sorry, but it sounded just exactly like the Peggy O'Neill from history, and I wondered if maybe this song was written about this Peggy O'Neill. It's a song that was started in that time, and if so, I just thought that would be kind of an interesting fact. And
Caller, thanks. We appreciate lots of
it certainly
detail
might
there.
be. I mean, there's, oftentimes you find songs, pieces of popular culture that pick up in an immediate kind of cultural icon. I wouldn't be surprised. Certainly the rage for Fanny Elsler at the time had all kinds of songs associated with it, even though she's another character that sort of faded from our memory. The Angelica Singleton portrait is probably one of Henry Inman's finest portraits. You see Angelica, actually, in the whole portrait, which is hanging in the Red Room of the White House right now, and you just have a section of it on your screen right now, but in the whole portrait, you'll also see in it the bust of Martin Van Buren, her father-in-law, who's the President of the United States, carved by Hiram Powers. And in the view of the library where we saw Dr. West earlier, you'll notice that the bust of Van Buren is there. That was known to be the best likeness of him in any medium. And certainly the Angelica portrait is a fabulous portrait.
Could you spend a minute? We really haven't focused in on the conduct of his White House. We've talked about lots of policy and issues, but during the 4 years he was in the White House, how did the public view it? How did he use the House?
Basically, he had an open house on New Year's where alcohol was not served because you remember the first inauguration of the Jackson administration in which the White House was sort of trampled a bit. So Van Buren used the White House for his charming little dinner parties, much along the lines of his political nature, kind of a one-on-one basis. You know, basically it was the people's house. It was unlocked and he walked around, but you know, he ran the White House much the way other presidents have run it. You know, he didn't have big, huge parties or anything. There was an interesting episode in which he, again, lost some favor. First, he renovated the White House, which basically hadn't been done since the first Jackson administration. So there was a request for several thousands of dollars to renovate the White House. That got him in a little trouble with the Congress. And then Angelica Singleton Van Buren, who was a young woman from South Carolina, decided for her opening at the White House, basically her debut as the daughter-in-law of the president, that they would do a stylized tableau. And in Grecian form, guests entered the house and they were all, you know, in their Grecian tableau. It didn't go over well. Needless to say, it sort of smacked of imperialism, and King Martin, you know, with King Andrew, he didn't do well. So they didn't do that again.
During his 4 years, rate his public popularity. He had the tough job of coming in after you're not on camera, so I'm going to want to have you do that again. But he had the tough job of coming in after an enormously popular president.
He had a very tough job.
Would you show again how you described his popularity?
Basically, when I said his popularity went sort of continually down. I mean, needless to say, he had the problem of the United States having its first major recession weeks after he was in office. He said, and probably rightly so, it was due to the expansion of credit. But he also, being a strict constructionalist, really believed that it was not the role of the federal government to save individuals. That was the role of the states or the communities or the church or somebody else. But the Constitution didn't give that role to the federal government. And needless to say, people were hurting, and they wanted the president to do something.
One more call, and then you'll meet one of Martin Van Buren's descendants. Roswell, Georgia, you're on the air.
Yes. I'm originally from Old Hickory, Tennessee, which was a suburb of where Andrew Jackson, the Hermitage is. I missed the first part of the program. Where was Van Buren born, and is the house that he was born still standing, and where did he spend his early part of his life? Thank you. I enjoyed the program very much.
Oh, sure. Well, he was born and bred in Kinderhook. The house that he grew up in, the tavern, burned down. The house that was there on the site after that burned down. And if you come to Kinderhook today, you'll see a wonderful kind of 1950s style house sitting on the site. But you will see the birth site, and it's quite close to where we are today at Lindenwold, where he lived for the last 21 years of his life. So Kinderhook's his hometown, and he returned here.
Well, speaking of hometowns and family, let us introduce you to Mary Lee Pell Whitmer, who is one of Martin Van Buren's descendants. Can you explain the lineage?
Yes, I certainly can. I'm a great-great-great-granddaughter of Martin Van Buren through his son, Smith Thompson Van Buren, and I happen to have a photograph of that family with me. Smith Thompson, known as Smith, married Ellen James, and they had a daughter, Ellen James Van Buren, who married Dr. Stuyvesant Fish Morris, pictured as an older fellow here, and they had a daughter named Ellen Van Buren Morris, who married Francis Livingston Pell, and they had a son named Walden Pell, and he and my mother, Edith Bonsall Pell, had me. So I'm a third great-great-great-granddaughter of the president.
Where is home for you now?
I live in Fairfield, Connecticut, with my husband and 3 sons.
And how often do you come to this site?
Well, I'm very privileged to be on the board of the Friends of Lindenwold, and although I don't attend every monthly meeting, and I should, I always love to come to the annual meeting, and that was just this past April. So I'd say I'm here at least one time a year, to my great pleasure.
What can you add to our body of knowledge about your ancestor, Martin Van Buren? What's important, do you think, for people to know about him?
Well, I think the important thing about Martin Van Buren, and I will really expand this to other presidents whose homes you're visiting, in every period there is a man, as it is so far, who steps forward to provide the leadership and to, for the country and to do the work of that time. And every president should be remembered forever, and we should study every president because past is prologue, and we learn so much from knowing about the presidents. I think Martin Van Buren, of course, held more political positions than any politician before or since. In a very short time. In 1821, he became a state senator in the state of New York, and by 1840, he was leaving the White House. That's a very short period to have accomplished all that. He was so innately strong in administrative and in understanding people's needs. He did have a hard time with that bank crisis, but he held steady. He was a steady Dutchman, and he knew what he was doing, and he proceeded to do what he was doing, and always very well.
We understand that you've come today wearing some artifacts from Martin Van Buren.
Yes. None of us have so very many artifacts, but on my graduation from school, my grandmother gave me these earrings, which are river pearl, and they were the cufflinks of the president. I can show you the top and the bottom. I love these earrings, as you can imagine. I have really no written provenance from them, but I think we all tend to try to believe our grandmothers, and I don't think she would dissemble.
How many living descendants are there today?
Yes, the Friends of Lindenwold and I are very eager to do that research. And just recently, I have done a little work, and I would say that there are about 40 from my line of the family. There is another family, the Emmons family, and if any Emmons are watching, please be in touch with me. We want to get more together and be more cohesive, but I'd say about 40.
How important is this connection for your family? Is it something that you've individually spent time, other than yourself, learning more about, or is it just a little niche in the family lineup?
That's such an interesting question. As we grew up as children, we were not expected to sit around daydreaming about illustrious ancestors. So there really wasn't much talk about Martin Van Buren or any other ancestors. We were meant to do our work and get along. But I think the older we get, and something about these times, my sons in their 30s are very interested in knowing more about Martin Van Buren. So I'm enormously proud of that, and enjoy studying more about it, and being, of course, at a perfectly glorious house, Lindenwold. But I'd say it was sort of a little bit of both.
Ms. Whitmer, stay with us because we're going to take a couple calls, and I hope you can help answer some of the questions that come in. Los Gatos, California, you are on the air. What's your question about Martin Van Buren?
Well, I visited, I was very pleased to have visited Lindenwold several years ago, and there were just three of us in this tour because it was the cold, dreary days just before the Lindenwold would be closed for the season, and there was the park ranger who was extremely courteous and extremely knowledgeable about what he was talking about. And I happened to ask a question about some plumbing early on, because I was curious about the amenities of such a large house, and so consequently everything that he talked about from then on in had to do with the plumbing. When we got to the master bath upstairs, I was very surprised to see not only the size of the amenities, but I also noticed that there was a very interesting piece of wedgewood in the bathroom upstairs, which was a very interesting use of the wedgewood at the time. My question is, the expression "okay," have you covered that yet this morning? We
started off our very first question about it, but we can come back to it for people who have joined us.
Well, because there's two. It was either from one of his campaigns, if you're okay if you're from Old Kinderhook, but the dictionaries also carry a German version of that. I'm just curious about comments that he might care to make on that, and I'll hang up and take
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
Ms. Whitmer, can you tell us from your visits here about the Wedgewood facilities?
I have no particular knowledge about them, except that I have certainly seen them and been very impressed with them. At the time this house was being built, it seems a transitional time and rather grand for a farmhouse too. But from the hole in the wall downstairs to the grand bathroom upstairs shows that the president really kept on top of recent developments, I think.
Patricia West, let's bring you in for why he would have had a porcelain toilet.
Well, you've seen it, and it certainly is elegant, isn't it? I think that just goes back to what we were saying before about Martin Van Buren really being very sensitive to his environment, loving beautiful things.
I called it porcelain. In fact, it's Wedgwood. That's much higher quality.
It's it's really, I don't know if you can get the full, you really must come and get the full impact of how really very pretty this is. We really like to, as I said before, link these rather remarkable objects to a rather remarkable gentleman, and I guess that's the moment to bring home, perhaps more than any other place in the house, the extent to which Martin Van Buren was very an aesthete. Absolutely.
We were asked about the origin of OK. You spent some time with it. Just a real brief explanation of OK.
Sure. Well, basically, OK first turns up in print in 1839 in a Boston newspaper. Certainly, during the period, people are known as, Old Fuss and Feathers or Old Hickory. Old Kinderhook is certainly a moniker that the Bucktails, the Tammany Society, attached to their man Van Buren. And throughout the whole election of 1840, OK kind of means, that Van Buren is all correct or OK. And then after he's turned out, basically loses the election of 1840, the Whigs snap it up and say, well, there's Van Buren, he's OK, he's off to Kinderhook. And OK remains one of the most popular Americanisms in the English language to this very day. Although Woodrow Wilson, another president, who you'll see later in the series, believed that OK, which he would spell O-K-E-H, was from the Choctaw for OK, and he believed that it came into the language that way. Would not spell OK, O period, K period. He would spell it O-K-E-H, and when asked why he spelled it O-K-E-H instead of OK, he would say, because the other is wrong.
Mary Lee Whitmer, Martin Van Buren descendant. We haven't talked about his religion. You talked about his Dutch roots. He was belonged to the Dutch Reformed Church. Did that stay a part of your family?
My father was actually an Episcopal priest, and I think that in our family we are generally Episcopalians. But while you mentioned the Dutch Reformed Church, I have a little story I might tell you. And of course, the Dutch Reformed Church is stone, and it was unheated at that time, so services were cold, and the good president had no hair at the top of his head. He had a bald pate. He took to bringing a little woolly square with him that he would put on the top of his bald pate during service. Well, the sexton thought that was really inappropriate. He didn't care for it. And the sexton's job, one of them, was to use a long, long stick to just tap that parishioner who might be nodding off. And from time to time, that sexton would just knock that little woolly square right off the president's head, just by accident. Well, they weren't the best of friends, those two. But no, we have gone on and become Episcopalians for the most part.
Yes.
Smith, your ancestor Smith Thompson, Martin Van Buren's son, converted to Episcopalianism, and actually at Martin Van Buren's funeral, there was also an Episcopal Mass read as well.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, I think his wife, Ellen James, was an Episcopalian, so perhaps she prevailed there.
Pasadena, Texas is next. Well, we lost Pasadena. You mentioned funeral. Let me next introduce our audience to the president's bedroom, which is the room in which he died. Can you talk a little bit about how he died?
Sure. Van Buren, of course, is 79 years old. Throughout the winter here in Kinderhook, he had been ill and ailing. He had always suffered from asthma and from gout, of course, 170 pounds and 5'6", and eating the rich foods that he didn't help contribute to that. You'll see here, this is the bedroom that he died in, and we know a little bit about this room, although most of the references are from pretty late. You'll notice the cane there on the bed. That cane was presented to Martin Van Buren. It's made from pieces of the flagship Niagara from the Battle of Lake Erie, and it says in a small silver plaque on it, "I have met the enemy and he is mine." Van Buren basically, through July, became sicker and sicker and bedridden. His sons, other than Martin Jr., who had died in Paris in the 50s, his three remaining sons were here, Smith and John and Abraham. And Van Buren basically lapsed in and out of consciousness. You know, there are quotes that are attributed to his last words. We don't have any solid documentation on them. Although, you know, he's thought to have said there is but one reliance. You'll also notice in that room there's a Bible that I think Dr. West mentioned earlier, was given to Martin Van Buren on his 70th birthday by his niece Christina Cantine, who was from his wife Hannah Huss's family. And it's interesting that there's still that very close connection. And she's written in it actually a lot of long prayers. And at the beginning it says, to teach us to number our days so that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom, which I think is a wonderfully telling statement, both for the time and for us today. It's the point of studying history. As Mrs. Buren said, you know, what's past is prologue. It's interesting in this inscription in this Bible, she also talks about the coming peril and the peril that the nation faces. This is, you know, this is still in the 50s. This is still 10 years away from the Civil War, but people know something's up. Things have not been going well, and
where is he buried?
Martin Van Buren is buried in the Dutch Reformed Cemetery in Kinderhook, along with his wife, Hannah Huss, who had been reinterred from the Albany Rural Cemetery when his son Martin Jr. died. He had Hannah and Martin Jr. placed there, and you see there the obelisk, a relatively simple obelisk, even in this graveyard, which marks his final resting place.
San Francisco, good morning. Caller, you're on the air. Welcome.
It's quite unfortunate that we are making Van Buren out to be a noble man, worthy of praise, when in fact his gag rule proved his rather sadistic desire to continue slavery that really hurt a lot of people. And I'm just wondering, how do we really justify talking so kindly of this man? And I think it's a continuation of the race problems we have in America, that we wish to praise men who really did quite terrible things to other human beings, and we put up monuments to them still to this day, and I just think it's unfortunate.
I think it's unfortunate to not have the discussion, and what I would be afraid is if that we didn't have places like this, we'd have no place to talk about the evils of slavery. Certainly, Martin Van Buren, as chief magistrate of the nation, was chief magistrate at a time that the United States was perpetuating the worst crime of humanity on a large group of the population. You know, I'm Black American myself. I feel that awful thing, but I also feel that it's important to have this conversation. And Martin Van Buren, like all other humans, do the best they can at the time and make compromises. And I think I agree with you. The compromises he made shouldn't have been made. But I'm not here to be a sycophant for Martin Van Buren. I'm not here to be an apologist for Martin Van Buren. He did do many good things. He also did many terrible things. Certainly Indian removal, the Trail of Tears, the supporting of the gag rule. These were all calculated political measures to keep the Union together. And I think if you look at Martin Van Buren's political career, focus the whole thing through Union maintenance and how critically important they felt that this experiment in democracy was, it gives you a different angle to look at. In no way do I want to say that Martin Van Buren was a great hero, or and to ignore the evils that were carried out under his administration or during the period. But if you look at Washington through Lincoln, those 16 presidents all are the chief magistrate charged with upholding the laws of the nation, a nation which has slavery written into the Constitution. It's constitutionally legitimized. This is a difficult position for any of them to be in, because in that position, they have to enforce the law. It's a tough call.
Mary Lee Whitmer, your thoughts on that caller's question?
I'm so glad that that question was asked. I'm not a great historian, and I think that the point of being an opportunity to raise these questions and to understand what the leadership, what the president and those around him, how they responded to slavery. In my own opinion, I think that Van Buren was personally anti-slavery, that he did not want that. But in context, you know, that was an enormously troubled time, and I think that we should all go back and study the events of that time more fully. No, we certainly don't want to gloss over and make anybody a person that he's not. So I'm very glad to be reminded of that from the caller.
We're going to say goodbye to you at this point because our time is running out quickly. I want to thank you for coming from Connecticut here to Kinderhook, New York, to help give a personal side to our study of Martin Van Buren.
My pleasure.
We have just about 6 minutes left, and in fact, I don't want to let the program end without learning a little bit more about his relations with the press. And Patricia West is in the library where there are a number of political cartoons on the walls. Would you talk about those, please?
Yes, the reason that we have the political cartoons placed in the library as we do is because we have documentation that Van Buren himself had some political cartoons placed around here in the library, which is really fascinating. We don't know if it was these particular cartoons, I should say, but we do know that he had them around, which suggests something that those of us who have read a lot of Van Buren correspondence already know, that he really did have quite an amazing sense of humor and a perspective about himself. Now, some of these cartoons are really rather harsh. You'll see some really unpleasant caricatures in them. Let's see, let me give you a couple of things to look for. One is you can look for images of Martin Van Buren as a fox, because of course his nickname was the Red Fox of Kinderhook. And in most of these cartoons, which are anti-Van Buren cartoons, you'll see that as an element of pathos. Obviously, this is not a flattering portrayal of Martin Van Buren as an elegant, clever fox. This is a pathetic little beast running along, being pursued by hounds. This is a motif you see again and again in Van Buren cartoons. Also, you'll see images of cabbages. Garnier in the upper left cartoon there, you'll see some cabbages in the corner. Now, one of the things I think about when I see this kind of cartoon is how culture-specific and time-specific political cartoons really are. Mm-hmm. Because to Michael and I talk about this a lot, that to the 20th century eye, what is that? That's a couple of cabbages. But to the 19th century eye, it's really clear what that is. That's an ethnic slur. It's easy to forget that Martin Van Buren was Dutch. It's not the predominant ethnicity of the country. Of course, it's an Anglo country. And Van Buren was really subject to continual reference to cabbages and cabbage eating and returning to his Kinderhook cabbages. And it's quite a bitter attack on Van Buren's ethnicity and on his roots.
Dr. West, let me interrupt you at that point, because we have a caller from Vermont who specifically wants to ask about the political cartoons. Shelburne, Vermont, go ahead.
Hello. I have 3 cartoons from 1848, and they're all about Martin Van Buren stealing from the Treasury. There's one that's particularly interesting. It's a great, huge box which says Treasury Box. It has Martin Van Buren's hand in the box, and it looks like a swan or a vulture or something on his back, I can't tell, and another man running away, and above him it says, "I'm off, Matty, but you are caught and will soon be a picked fowl."
I think there was probably from 1840 rather than 48. And the reason I say that is because the sub-treasury system was such a hot issue at the end of the Jackson administration, with the suspension of specie circular, with the not recharting the Second Bank of the United States. Basically, the Jackson administration had put all of the federal government's money into state banks or private banks. They were known as the pet banks. And of course, as the Van Buren administration starts, the banking system's just totally collapses. And the sub-treasury issues, of course, they couldn't come back in 1848 because during the, July 4th, 1840, the Independent Treasury System Act passes. It's repealed during the Polk administration. It passes again during the Tyler administration. There's a lot of back and forth on those Treasury issues, but basically the underlying issue is that the Democrats and their cronies are putting federal funds into banks of their friends, basically, rather than having an independent Treasury system. That's really a little unfair to Van Buren, but I would venture those cartoons might come from that. Cartoons are so highly contextual, just like with the cabbage issue, you know, to understand those slurs and insults, you almost have to be there.
Our last call is from Albany. Albany, what's your question?
Yes, thank you so much for this program. My question is this. I'm descended myself from an old New York Dutch family, but also an Irish family. And it was interesting for me to hear that Van Buren had Irish servants in the house. I was wondering, did Van Buren have a position on immigration, and in particular on Roman Catholics immigrating to the United States? And did he have something to do with the Free Soiler Party? I've been told that he was involved with them and that he was anti-Catholic, but I'm trying to resolve my roots here.
Thanks very much. We have to let you go. We only have 1 minute left.
Okay, I'm going to say the Free Soilers weren't necessarily anti-Catholic. You kind of get those in the Know-Nothing Party. I don't know that Van Buren had a policy on Roman Catholicism per se. I mean, most Americans thought that they were beholden to the Pope, so they were foreigners under a foreigner's control. It was a touchy issue.
Very quickly done. In our short time left, Martin Van Buren, 8th President of the United States, had been a vice president, a widower president, wanted to come back unsuccessful. As we close here, describe his leadership style.
His leadership style was very much behind the scenes. He was a coalition builder. He was a compromiser. Just like his quote, mutual forbearance and reciprocal concessions, we all have to give a little bit. In a democracy that's based on a majority, in order to get a majority, a lot of people have to give up a little bit. And I think his legacy is that not through wars, not through coups, but through parties and through discussions that we can have this experiment in democracy continue.
How is this country different because he was president?
Just think of what if Calhoun had been president for the second Jackson administration. It could have been a very different country. I won't speculate in what-if history, but I think what he did contribute was a solid framework for the establishment of the parties.
Our thanks to the National Park Service and specifically to the staff here at Lindenwold, here in Kinderhook, New York, headed up by Michael Henderson, who has been kind enough to be our guest for the past 2.5 hours. And special thanks to Patricia West, Dr. West, the curator here at the Martin Van Buren Historic Site, and to Mary Lee Pell-Whitmer, Martin Van Buren's descendant, all of whom have helped us understand a bit better the life and times of our 8th president of the United States. And also a special thanks to Time Warner, who is the cable operator in this area, for their help as we put together this program. Next week, we are on to President Harrison, so more to come as C-SPAN's American Presidents Tour continues. Thank you from Kinderhook, New York.